Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream. Let me just do a little bit of boomer tech here. It's because there's a delay on YouTube, so I have to silence it once it starts.
It's endearing, really.
Yeah, well, if it wasn't boomer tech, it wouldn't be one of my streams. So.
Yeah.
And that one's done as well. Okay, ladies and gents, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I don't think we're going to have Aaron this week because he's looking after some junior members of his family, 3 of them, so he didn't think he'd be able to stream. And I haven't heard from Bo from History Bro. I've sent him the link, and we will see if he gets it. Hopefully he will join us. I have another special guest this week, Mr. Streets, and we're going to be joined by Marcus Furius in due course. He's just making himself a cup of coffee. Now, in part 1 of this stream, as people will remember, and if you haven't seen it, please go and check it out. We went from 1900 to 1933, covering Churchill's political career in fairly exhaustive detail. And we got to about 1933, and we'd been going about 2 hours and 20 minutes. So we decided we'd make a part 2, which is what this stream is. Obviously, 1933 is the year that Moustache Man comes to power in Germany. But we're not going to be going on about that because you get a lot of people say that if you're critical of Churchill, you are somehow an apologist for AH. Well, other people's mileage may vary, but I'm not particularly. I'm not in favor of Britain joining World War II in 1939, as this stream I think will make clear. But I'm not a big fan of AH. And I don't think anyone else who's coming on this stream is either, but I'll let them speak for themselves on this. I'm waffling a bit, but I'm giving people a chance to come in and join in the audience. But yeah, Churchill's career up until this point was not strongly in favor of making Britain and the Empire stronger, shall we say. His first major speech in Parliament was against expanding the British Army in the middle of the biggest war that Britain fought between 1815 and 1914. Mm-hmm. He was totally against Imperial. He was totally against the Aliens Act, which was the first attempt to control immigration into Britain. And also, of course, he was totally against Imperial tariff reform, which was the last best chance to change the old Commonwealth of the Empire, which is to say the White Empire, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back in those days, South Africa, into something a bit more than just sentiment and having the same monarch. It could have led to an imperial parliament that would have covered defense and foreign policy issues. Didn't, of course, because people like Churchill, Churchill even crossed the floor over it and joined the Liberal Party. By this time in 1933, he's crossed the floor again and gone back to the Conservatives, because Churchill was a conviction politician, don't you know, except when it suited him not to be a conviction politician. He's got a rabid anti-Marxist label on him at this stage, but as we shall see, that's another conviction which he doesn't keep.
And not just in the marriage of convenience in World War II as well. We'll see actually long before that, he's having very frequent discussions with the Soviet ambassador during his wilderness years. And, yeah, it's just very, very interesting stuff. And in terms of the being against the empire in the beginning of his career, the sort of fruits of the seeds that he planted then have now grown. So by 1933, Canada, for example, is highly, highly dependent on the United States economically and financially. And there's still very strong shipbuilding in Canada that contributes quite heavily to the British Navy. But the Canadians and most of America, because remember, we dominated Argentina, Venezuela, even though it wasn't part of our empire, it was part of our informal empire. They've already basically gone into the American sphere. And that could have very easily been prevented with some basic, sort of fraternal integration of the empire.
We on the last episode, the first episode, we did talk a bit about the Washington Naval Treaty, for example, which restricted, which basically was Britain giving away command of the oceans, because half the Royal Navy ended up being scrapped, so that we ended up with the same number of battleships as the Americans, which was great for the Americans because they didn't even have to build extra ships. Not so great for the Royal Navy, who went from being easily the biggest navy in the world to only very slightly bigger than the Americans, even though America, obviously, the American Navy is responsible really for defending their East Coast and their West Coast. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, back in the 20s and 30s, had to defend the whole of the British Empire, which was basically all over the world.
Absolutely.
So we needed more ships than the Americans did. And on top of that, we got rid of our excellent alliance with Japan. And Japan had been an excellent ally to Britain from 1902 until 1922.
Very loyal.
Yeah, and we deeply offended them at the same time. And of course, we did this not in return for an American alliance, which the Americans absolutely refused, but just so that we could do the Washington Naval Treaty and make our Navy much weaker. It was an insane deal as far as I'm concerned.
And there's going to be several of these times in Churchill's career where we see there are some very specific things where nothing is too great a cost to achieve, specifically war with Germany, no matter how cataclysmic it is. And then there are several other things that are critical to our power in the world. And Churchill's excuse is basically it's too much effort. And particularly anything that involves standing up to America. It basically, that would be a bit too much. It's too expensive. There are zero financial arguments when it comes to fighting Germany, for example. Churchill will never say during his wilderness years, it's a bit expensive to start a war in Europe. But when it comes to America, of course, Churchill was half American himself. There's all kinds of these rather mundane, petty excuses.
Very true. Yeah, very true. I mean, we talked about Churchill's mother being the daughter of an American millionaire, basically. And I always think that when you look at Churchill and you listen to some of his speeches and you read some of his books, and I've read a lot of Churchill's writings.
Absolutely.
I don't think he ever really felt he was just an Englishman, you know? One of his very famous works is The History of the English-Speaking Peoples, as if that means very much, you know? I don't think he was a particularly British nationalist guy. I think, and there was some of that about in the British elites in those days. It wasn't really reciprocated in America, but there was some of it in Britain. But Churchill was an extreme example.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could say, for example, Churchill's this supposedly, at least, this big imperialist. You can argue if there's basically a conflict between being a nationalist and being an imperialist, right? Because if you're wasting a lot of energy, for example, on imperial wars, that will then suck out a lot of from your own finances and people. Is that actually a nationalist position, or is it almost like a supranationalist?
Listen, I would have been a big supporter of the old Commonwealth, which is to say the White Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back then South Africa. I think you could be a nationalist and support that part of the empire. But Churchill was always much more concerned with hanging on to India, for example.
Yeah, which really was, we lost money on that since about 1900. I think it would be an incredibly difficult thing to leave it with dignity. So I definitely wouldn't have left it if it was in 1930 or 1940 or 1950. But at a bare minimum, our strategic points, Sri Lanka, the Gulf, Singapore, Suez, all over the Indian Ocean will be absolutely critical. And I do actually want to hint at the end of this stream, and actually at the end of Churchill's career, he presided after mentoring these guys like Eden and Macmillan over the East of Suez policy.
Yes.
And it's yet another one where he says he doesn't like it. He doesn't actually do anything to stop it. Where all of these, not just these great land masses, like you think of, Bengal, for example, with all their population. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the strategic choke points in the world that we had, and then just give it up. And basically, it's because of American pressure and bankruptcy. But again, there was no cost that Churchill wasn't willing to pay when it came to destroying Germany. But as soon as Suez comes, it's like we can't stand up to this superpower.
Churchill did say one sensible thing at the time of the Suez crisis in 1956, and of course this was the same Anthony Eden who had turned Italy into an enemy of Britain over Abyssinia in the 1930s. And Churchill turned around and said, I think I'm trying to remember what he said there. He said he wouldn't have dared do it, which was the Suez expedition. But he said, had I dared to do it, I wouldn't have dared stop. Because, of course, that was the worst of both worlds, because it was a total humiliation for Britain.
Yep. And he did say, for example, he needs American help. And in the strategic situation of, say, the 1950s, totally disregarding all the past that happened, you did need America there. And for example, Churchill successfully secured our interests in Iran in 1952, 1953 with Mossadegh, which a lot of people complain about, but I don't see the modern anti-colonial movement complaining about the 1941 coup that took over Iran. And the reason was Stalin was involved in that, and also Iran was basically pro, Adolf at that time. They changed their name to make themselves some Aryan.
I think I'm right in saying Britain invaded one side and Stalin invaded the other.
Absolutely. And all of a sudden there's this, war against aggression, unless it's anyone except Germany. But I think that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's keep it chronological.
Yeah, but basically we're now in what Churchill fans will often call the wilderness years, and they'll make movies about all this stuff and what have you. And from about, Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933, and from about certainly 1935, Churchill is urging Britain to rearm against Germany. Okay. And I just wanted to point out something I was talking to you about before we went live, that if Britain had rearmed, say, the Royal Air Force in 1935, the RAF would have ended up with a huge fleet of biplanes, which would have been totally useless. The Hawker Hurricane which was the first of the two classic fighters of the Battle of Britain, the Hawker Hurricane was only just starting to enter squadron service in early 1938. And the Spitfire was still another 18 months away from entering squadron service.
Well, look at what happened with the Russians in 1941. They had a larger air force on paper than all the other countries of the world combined,
Yes.
but they had a load of biplanes, and so they all got destroyed on the ground in Operation Barbarossa, and it didn't count for anything that they had this massive
air force.
Furious Pertinax, how you doing?
Good morning, gentlemen. Sorry, everyone, I was a little bit behind. Bigger time difference between myself and Iron Duke than usual, but thank you, Iron Duke. Good to be here for part 2 at least.
Yeah, no, that's good. As I say, I've sent Bo the link. I don't know what's happened. He hasn't got it. Maybe he's had an emergency or what have you.
I'll try and give him a heads up by other means.
Yeah, if you can. I mean, he can join us at any stage, and we're certainly going to go a couple of hours.
Absolutely. Just the point that Mr. Streets made, I would also reiterate too that kind of a similar policy in terms of numbers versus strength. On paper, for instance, the Italians had thousands and thousands of tanks, but they were technically tankettes, which doesn't really reflect actual armored strength, like on a divisional basis, if you get what I mean.
I was just going to ask you something actually, because we've got you here, Furious. I don't know if you heard part 1 of this stream.
I caught fragments of it, but I haven't watched it from back to back. Sorry.
Okay. Well, one of the things we talk about in that is that in the 1930s, Britain, as I know you know, Mussolini was not great pals with AH. And
certainly not to begin with, at least. Yes.
No. Yeah. And the first time that there was talk about the Nazis taking over in Austria, which was actually done by Austrian Nazis and not by Hitler at all.
Yes,
Mussolini,
Sayers Equard, I think it was, who sort of led the coup from inside Austria. Yeah.
Yeah, and Hitler was quite angry about this because he thought it was premature. And Mussolini actually sent Italian divisions to the Brenner Pass in the Alps. He wasn't very happy. Yeah. And the thing is, Britain became an enemy of Mussolini basically over Abyssinia, which has never made any sense.
Something which my grandfather spoke about to almost the day he died, actually, with great resentment, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, because, Ethiopia was an Italian sphere of influence going back into the 1890s. The Battle of Adwa, which was the big Italian disaster, I think was 1896. So it was a couple of years before the Battle of Omdurman. British colonists in Kenya shared a border with the Italians in Eritrea and got on great with them. They had no problems
on both sides. You got to think because the Italians had Somaliland as well, so they shared the border in the south and the border with Eritrea up alongside the protectorate of Ethiopia.
Because there was also British Somalia. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
Somaliland,
all of that.
Somaliland. But all those guys got on fine, and I'm pretty certain that Italy probably ran Ethiopia better than Emperor Haile Selassie, who was a typical African dictator in many respects.
Indeed, and there's a very famous document.
Slave state,
Oh, Mr. Streets, I think you beat me to it. I was going to say there's a very famous document that displays the banning of slavery in Ethiopia, and it took a fascist government to impose that on an African nation. But they don't teach that in schools.
Yeah, so I don't really think it was necessary for Britain and Italy to become enemies. It was pretty obvious that Mussolini was not desperately keen to get into World War II in 1939 and 1940. And in fact, I believe he said that Italy wouldn't really be ready for a war until 1942.
41, 42 at the earliest, yeah.
Yeah, which, funnily enough, was what the Royal Navy was also working towards in the 1930s, was 41, 42.
Which is reflected also, it's also reflected in their adherence to the London Naval Treaty. whilst the Germans and to some degree the Italians were sort of cheating the numbers a little bit. I mean, the Allied powers, to their credit, were, to my knowledge, more strictly adhered to the London Naval Treaty, which limited displacement of their capital ships.
Oh, Britain did a few things, like, for example, the county-class heavy cruisers used to ride suspiciously high in the water in the 1920s, and then when World War II broke out, all this already prepared armour was put onto them to make the armour thicker, and then they sat where they were supposed to sit in the water. But all countries did little cons like that. The Americans did to some degree with their 2 huge aircraft carriers that they converted from battle cruisers. There was a lot of cheating went on in the Washington and London naval treaties. But as I was talking about somewhat about this to Aaron, who was on last week's stream, in my Discord, and the Italian Navy was never built to fight the Royal Navy. The Italian Navy was built to either fight or deter the French Navy.
Correct, yeah.
Which again is something people don't always take notice of. I mean,
which is reflect.
He never thought the Italian Navy could beat the Royal Navy on its own. It wasn't his idea at all.
No, and also it was a. First point. It's reflected in the fact that Italian anti-air gunnery was not particularly advanced. Probably the weak point of the Regina Marina, and of course the French really didn't have much in the way of naval aviation compared to, say, I mean, I know people kind of laugh at the British with the what are the biplanes that they had on the
swordfish
the ferry swordfish, but in the end, I mean, look what they did at Taranto in 42. I mean, they were still capable aircraft, even though they were modest. But I mean, when you consider that, particularly for the Americans and the Japanese, naval aviation was, well, they saw the future, and they very much embraced that outlook on aerial naval warfare. The British were sort of halfway there, whereas certainly the Italians and the French adhered to a more sort of capital ship, decisive battle doctrine, you might say.
Well, I'm gonna actually.
Maybe was geared to fight the French more than anyone else.
Furious, I'm going to actually have something to say about British carrier aviation in World War II a bit further on in the stream.
Ah, right. Excellent.
When Winston Babes is made First Lord of the Admiralty again, which is the political head of the Royal Navy in 1939. But anyway, I think that was a bit of an aside I thought I'd talk to you about, because I know you're interested in that era of Italian history.
Can I add with Abyssinia? There's also another point where, as I was saying before the stream, my research to prepare for this stream has actually moderated me a little bit towards Churchill. There's a range of different sources. You might say the official historian Martin Gilbert is very biased towards Churchill. Obviously, you've got hugely his own Churchill's own books, for example, which I've got a lot to talk about. I'd say, for example, Irving's Churchill's War is biased in the other direction.
Yes, it is.
Calling him fat bot, all that sort of stuff, like I've noticed. And I think a genuine mean in the middle, a balanced one, might be Patrick Buchanan.
Oh yeah, in The Unnecessary War. Yeah, that's an excellent book. And I actually did, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 streams with Horace, basically going through the Unnecessary War and covering a lot of this kind of stuff, but more from a military history point of view.
Sure. But basically Churchill with Abyssinia, he actually made the point that you're making now, that we don't need to make Italy into an enemy. And if your goal is to contain Germany, which, aside whether that's right or wrong, that was Churchill's goal. He did say, look, the Italians shouldn't have gone into Abyssinia, but we got to see the bigger picture here. So I do give him credit for that, because Italy is one of the only, it was really the only power that could have maintained the Danubian countries from German domination.
I think, look, the objection to this I've had with people, with discussions I've been having in private over the last week between these 2 streams, I've had people say, oh no, Mussolini was always going to end up in the German camp, and that he was bellicose about taking places like Malta and Egypt from the British. But so far as I can see from my reading and research, that was only after the disasters of 1940 that Mussolini started saying, oh yeah, well, we'll try and take Italy, and we ought to be able to invade Malta and all this kind of stuff. He didn't talk about that stuff in the 1930s at all, as far as I can work out.
Fascinating. And this does raise a point.
For instance,
oh, please.
Oh, sorry. Go Streets. You go first. I'll come up.
I was just going to say that there's going to be a theme, and again, I'm not trying to play devil's advocate here and be pro Churchill, but some of the mistakes in World War II will basically be because the leadership, specifically Churchill, he's looking not just at a tactical victory, but he's looking at political victories through military operations to shore up morale, and including several very silly things, the raid on Dieppe, attacking Sicily and Italy, for example, I think was a waste. Conquering Syria and Lebanon, but basically massive. But I think those sorts of operations, particularly, for example, Syria, that he invaded Syria basically just so de Gaulle could have a significant province to govern that made him look legitimate. However, I actually don't give Churchill a negative for that, because every single political leader did that in World War II. Stalin did it with his massive offensives. Hitler did it with like Kursk, Operation Citadel, which was to shore up Romania and Italy, like morally supporting him and staying in the Axis. And as you just mentioned, Mussolini says, look, we've just lost a battle. We need a win politically. We need to use the military to have a political win to keep up morale. So I think a lot of the mistakes that Churchill's going to do in this war, not to excuse him, but it's stuff that all of the leaders do because they're thinking politically and not just militarily.
For sure.
Victories in essence, yeah.
For sure. Furious, before we actually get back on course on the stream, you had something you wanted to say there about...
Yeah. So just 2 quick points. Let me go chronologically. That will be easier. What's interesting is that I remember my grandfather talking about this, because I don't think I've even mentioned this before, but he wasn't present in North Africa in 1941. He was basically dispatched with the Italian reinforcements that followed with the Africa Corps in early 1942. So he wasn't a part of that first encirclement by the O'Connor and that reconnaissance in force. He wasn't involved with that at all. But he remembers that when the war broke out, a lot of the rhetoric regarding, or not even when the war broke out, before the war broke out in the late 1930s. Obviously, one of the great, because the Abyssinia war broke out in late 1935 into 1936, and he remembered quite distinctly that one of the propaganda things that the Italian papers used to print out was the great refutation amongst the French and the British. Their great agitation with the Ethiopia offensive was the idea of it, sort of like it's a colonial enterprise, and Ethiopia is a sovereign nation, yada yada yada. And that very famous photo of Cecil Rhodes with like a foot in Egypt and a foot on the Cape, and he's standing over Africa, the whole Cape to Cairo.
The cartoon, yes, I know that.
Yeah. My grandfather remembers actually the Italian papers printing that off, basically like highlighting British hypocrisy about the idea of the Italians conquering Ethiopia, which I thought was a funny anecdote actually, because I've never seen that paperclip in person, but my grandfather recalled it being printed back in the like 1936 or whatever it was, basically as you might say, like as a domestic propaganda exercise.
Yeah.
But I thought it was an interesting thing anyway. And even for the Italians, one of the great objections was that they felt, and I don't know if you've touched on this, Iron Duke, but at the end of World War One, there's a phrase, and it's still sort of used in Italy today amongst historical circles, called "la vittoria mutilata," the mutilated victory. And all of the Italian men that were thrust into battle, particularly in the Alps, on the Isonzo front, there were over a dozen battles of the Isonzo.
They were not.
The Austrians.
They were not given some of the places that they were promised if they joined the war. Yes, this is
yeah.
true.
So like Dalmatia, much of the Adriatic coast, parts of Africa, that sort of stuff. And there's this perception that exactly Fulgrim, literally reposting their memes, 1936 style. There's literally this sort of idea that the British and the French, gorged on the
Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, well, the Ottoman Empire, the German. You got to think, Tanganyika, German East Africa, Namibia, German Southwest Africa, etc. The French and the British gorged themselves on the spoils of victory, and the Italians are sort of left with just crumbs, which made ultimately the Italian choice to secure an alliance with Germany easier. Once, shall I say, affairs on the continent took a direction. But I mean, we'll get there later in the stream. I just wanted to offer some basis because it does have a post-World War One, context.
I agree.
And the second thing I wanted to mention was oh god, what was the second point? Because I was going to buttress something the Streets just said, and I've since forgotten it. Sorry, let's just move on. I'll circle back to it. Oh no, I remember now. If I'm not mistaken, the first reference that Mussolini specifically makes about Italian claims in the Mediterranean was his very famous Taranto speech in 1940, and I'm not aware of any time in a speech prior to which Mussolini actually conjures up I mean, there was obviously disgruntlement about Ethiopia and East Africa in 35, 36, but in terms of actually sort of making statements about Malta and the whole restoration of Mare Nostrum our sea, if I'm not mistaken, I think that first came up in his Toronto speech in 1940. So you're about bang on in terms of chronology there, Iron Duke, if memory serves me right.
I thought so. Yeah, it was after the fall of France and when the British Army had been kicked out of Europe. It was only then that Mussolini started talking about Malta and Egypt and so on.
Exactly.
And
fair enough.
I kind of understand why, But and he was unfortunate in the probably the best trained division in the British Army was in the Middle East, but and one of the best British generals.
Iron Duke?
It was the Western Desert Force. It was called, and it was under. And General Richard O'Connor was an excellent general, an exceptionally good British general.
Yes, no, he was. He was excellent.
It was a shame that he was captured and then spent quite a lot of the war as a prisoner. But anyway, this is taking us a long way from from politics and Winston Churchill.
Yes.
So Winston Churchill has crossed back to the Conservative Party. Conservatives were then kicked out of government in favour of Ramsay MacDonald and a Labour Liberal kind of alliance government. And Churchill gets him. Churchill was always chronically in debt. He was never able to balance his own budget, which is ironic given he was Chancellor of the Exchequer at one stage, and of course refused to pay for defences in Singapore, which will come back to haunt Churchill and the British in 1941 and 1942. But yeah, Churchill refused to pay for that stuff as Chancellor of the Exchequer. But Churchill was mistrusted deeply by most Conservatives in the 1930s because of the fact he crossed the floor twice now. Which does not say that he was a man of principle, if you ask me. I mean, I think you can do that once. I spoke to Bo about this last week. I think anyone can think that the party they're a member of is going in the wrong direction and change once, but changing twice, it's kind of pushing it,
It's one thing to have. It's one thing to have a crisis of conscience. It's another thing to flip flop, you might say.
Yes, exactly. But Churchill was deeply mistrusted by most actual Conservatives in the 30s, And so he goes into this period that Churchill biographers, favourable Churchill biographers, call the wilderness years. And as I say, he was calling from about 1935 for Britain to start rearming. Now, the fact is, Britain did kind of start rearming in about 1936. Firstly with the Royal Navy, which is obviously
the Shadow Scheme, correct?
Yeah, or mostly with the Royal Navy, because that's the most important service to the Brits as an island nation with a worldwide empire in the mid-1930s. But it was a good thing he didn't get his way on the RAF, because the RAF would have ended up with a huge fleet of biplanes, which would have been pretty damn useless in 1940.
Because that's a mistake the Italians made with their tanks, essentially. Building up a massive amount of tanks, in the late 30s. And so when it came to actually fighting the British in Africa, well, our tanks were redundant, and you guys had the Matildas and the Crusaders.
Yep, pretty much. But on the other hand, of course, in the Middle East, you had British Gladiator biplanes fighting Italian Fiat CR-42s or whatever.
Yeah.
So you know,
romantically like it's World War One.
Yeah, it would have been just like World War One. You had biplanes fighting each other. I mean, when the Italians were attacking Malta initially, you had Italian. I think they were Macchi CR-42s. Fighting Gloucester Sea Gladiators, the famous Faith Open Charity, Free Sea Gladiators. So this was still going on, but not in Britain. At the time of the Battle of Britain, there was one Gladiator squadron still in RAF Fire Command in Britain. But anyway, we're getting well ahead of ourselves. Now, as I said, Churchill was always chronically in debt. And so in the 1930s, he gets contacted by various people. And I'm trying, because we're on YouTube, I've got to phrase this carefully. Let's say that many of them were from a certain religious, racial group. And this group eventually became known as the Focus Group, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. And Churchill was being passed secret papers from the British government illegally, which he shouldn't have been, because he wasn't even a member of the cabinet at this time. Churchill was, and he was also getting passed quite a lot of exaggerated stuff about Germany's rearmament, particularly of the German Air Force, of the Luftwaffe, which didn't grow half as quickly as Churchill claimed it did, but so he was getting passed lots of information. He was getting a lot of his debts paid by people from rich film producers. Alexander Korda is one that comes to mind, and also other less well-known people.
Various financiers, shall we say?
Yeah, banking people and what have you. And it was very much. It was very much a small hat group, to be honest.
Well, and then two more things on top of that. He's getting several advances for newspaper clippings that don't get published. He's getting paid, for example, that film producer that you're talking about. He's being advised. Korda, He's getting advisory fees on films that never see the cinema. They get cancelled like mid through, but he still gets paid for this advisory stuff. And then on top of that, some of his debts, I was looking into detail as a sort of entrepreneur myself. I was thinking, okay, what are these shady deals he's doing and all that sort of stuff? And basically he goes into overdraft with some of his stockbrokers. He famously loses everything in the Wall Street crash, like all his stocks. But then he buys back several times in the 1930s. And on top of that, there's several times where his stockbrokers say, Winston, you owe us money. And that can only be done if you're doing highly leveraged trading. I've done that myself. When you deal with leverage, it's a double-edged sword. I remember one time I was trading one that made 100 grand in a week, and then the week after that, it turned into negative 170 grand. So this stuff happens all the time, and Churchill was in the middle of this. But I think it is quite significant that one time, his big financial advisor and friend and benefactor, a guy called Bernard Baruch, Churchill is a bit worried about some of his investments. And so he asks Bernard Baruch, who's a big Wall Street guy, hey, what should I do? Should I sell or should I keep? Baruch says, hey, steady as she goes, keep the stocks. And a couple of weeks later, Churchill's wiped out again. And who is the guy who is introducing some of these people from all over the place to bail him out? It's Bernard Baruch, the same guy who gave him the bad advice, which put him in all this debt in the first place. Not all of it, but at least some of it.
Some might say, well.
Yeah, literally. I mean,
sorry, Andrew.
I was just going to say it's a very Anglo name, Bernard Baruch. Not, but yeah. If you want to know who Alexander Korda is, by the way, go and watch the 1930s version of The Four Feathers. And it's actually a good film. It's in Technicolor. They use real gunboats that really did take part in the cartoon campaign that Churchill was in. They say that some of the extras actually fought the Battle of London. So yeah, because it was made in the mid 1930s. But if you want to know who Alexander Korda was, he was probably the biggest British film director in the 1930s, and yes, he was a small hat, obviously. But anyway,
I want to also actually give another point to that. That it is completely rational that a pressure group like that would push for and try and get some politicians to be antagonistic towards Germany. But there were several other pressure groups in different directions that were trying to finance that just didn't have the same sort of muscle or will to influence. And I'm talking specifically Lord Beaverbrook.
These guys had a lot of money, and they also had good connections inside the British government, because Churchill was getting secret British papers, which there's no way he should have got.
Yeah, as a backbencher.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be on there. But two examples of pressure groups that tried to fund him as well. Lord Beaverbrook was one of them. He put several people on the payroll, and he was basically pro-peace. But he basically just didn't give nearly as much money as these guys did, so it didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, Beaverbrook was Canadian, if I remember correctly, originally.
Another great example of what could happen if we unite these countries and put our brains together. But and another one was the Czechs themselves were paying a lot directly to Churchill and other people in order to be antagonistic towards Germany.
Yep, absolutely correct. Look, we've got to some degree start talking about Neville Chamberlain. Now, I think Neville Chamberlain was a bit like the curate's egg. He was good in parts. I think he was entirely correct not to go to war in 1938, but I think he was entirely incorrect to basically give Poland the British war button in 1939. He completely, by guaranteeing Poland, he lost Britain all freedom of action. And let's remember that Poland was a military dictatorship. It wasn't a democracy. It was a military dictatorship. It just not a very efficient one. And it had a vastly oversized opinion of its own abilities and resources.
It was an empire in itself, really. In the sense that it had many non-Polish in the sense they had so many non-Polish populations. It had conquered the capital of Lithuania from the Lithuanians, Vilnius, and is actually
quite an underhanded fashion.
Absolutely. And for example, Stalin was regarded as like this benevolent guy when he handed back Vilnius to the Lithuanians before he conquered them. And on top of that, the Poles took part in the partition of Czechoslovakia.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
The Zaluzy region next to the Sudetenland, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, they did. As I say, my basic position on this as an Englishman is that Chamberlain was entirely correct not to go to war in 1938. But I think he was entirely incorrect to go to war in 1939, and particularly over Poland, which was a nation Britain or France could not help. There was no way that Britain or France could help Poland. There was no possibility of doing so. And it got us into a war, and it turned what would have been a local European war between Germany and Poland into a world war.
Absolutely, and on top of that, the Poles had very little chance of even having a sustained sort of guerrilla warfare style. That, for example, that Japan got bogged down in China, whereas the Czechs, they have a lot of mountainous regions, that kind of stuff. At least the Czechs would have had a chance of resistance, because on top of that, the Czechs produced almost all the armaments for Yugoslavia and Romania. And so as soon as the armaments of Prague fell to the Germans, all of the other countries in the Little Entente were downstream of that. And so they had very little choice but to then side with the Germans, even though Romania was very reluctant, Bulgaria was very reluctant. And
Yugoslavia.
Absolutely.
Look, that's a fact. I mean, in 1940, almost a third of the German panzer divisions had Czech tanks. So, this is true.
The 38T, which was converted from the Skoda Works tank.
Yeah. There was the 38T, and there was another one, I believe, as well. But about a third of the German tanks in the invasion of France, Belgium, and Holland in 1940 were Czech tanks.
Is that an argument?
Vastly reinforced them.
Is that an argument against Munich? Now, I do appreciate that we had a long-term advantage over the Germans in terms of production. And so by the 1940s, the longer you could sort of wait it out, the more advantage we had, kind of like the Minsk agreements in Ukraine.
I'm going to slightly disagree with you there, because the British government advisors, the financial British government advisors, basically the military told the British government, we can't win a short war. And the financial guys said, we can't afford a long war.
Interesting.
Like all the expert British financial guys, Bank of England, blah, 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 all turned around and said, we cannot survive a long war because financially we're just going to go bankrupt. And the military guys, particularly the Navy guys, on whom Britain always mostly depends, said, but we can't win a short war. We don't have enough troops. British Army's quite small. Of course, the British Army was massive in 1939 compared to now, but in 1939 it was quite small by European standards. And the RAF was relatively powerful by 1940, as proved to be the case in 1940. Certainly defensively, but the Navy was still just about the biggest Navy in the world, and the German Navy was very small. Like, you know, if you're my age, or like I was born in 65,
small but modern, just to say.
Well, yeah, it was, but I think you can make a good argument that the modern Italian battleships were actually better ships than the Bismarck class. They had an extra 15-inch gun for one thing. But
Oh yeah, like say Roma, for instance. Yeah, that's a good call. Good point.
yeah, Bismarck and
Tirpitz. Yeah.
were less heavily armored than the British King George V class, and had a number of weaknesses. Now, look, all right, I'm into naval warfare, so I've gone into some of the details of this, but I'm not going to bore people listening to this stream with it.
Yeah, I'll leave your thought though, Iron Duke. I think German strength lied in its pocket battleships, say for example Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, and also in the heavy cruisers like Prinz Eugen.
Not even no. I have to disagree with you.
Okay.
No, I have to disagree, Furius. Again, I think the Italian.
I mean, you know more than me. I'm just asking.
I think the Italian heavy cruisers were better ships. If you look at, for example, Prinz Eugen and the other 3 German heavy cruisers, they only had
Graf Spee and Blücher.
No. Graf Spee was a pocket battleship, which was really an armored cruiser, but whatever.
Yeah, it was sort of like halfway between them, but yes.
But if Blücher was another Prinz Eugen class ship, and I can't remember the other one now. But anyway, the point is these ships were about 4,000 tons bigger than the British County class, but had no more firepower and not a lot more armor.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah.
Like
I think Grun was the other ship. Maybe I can't remember.
It could be, but the German pocket battleships, like the Graf Spee, for example, they had 6 11-inch guns, but only in 2 turrets, and they had, I can't remember if it was 6 or 8 5.9-inch guns.
I think it was 6.
And if you look at the Battle of the River Plate, for example, 2 British light cruisers with 8 6-inch guns each, and 1 small heavy cruiser with 6-inch guns defeated the Graf Spee.
Yeah.
The German, the Italian Navy was probably 3 times stronger than the German Navy in 1940.
Yeah, at least, and definitely in terms of like escorts and like support ships, destroyers, and light cruisers, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Look, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were quite powerful ships. They were quite heavily armored. They were quite
for the displacement. Yeah.
Yeah, but they only had 9 11-inch guns, which in terms of battleships was pretty damn small. Which is why Scharnhorst was easily sunk by King George. Not King George V. I remember the ship. One of the King George V ships in 1943. She got sunk in the Arctic, and quite easily as well.
Off Narvik, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Narvik was another thing, but we'll come on to that in a minute because we're going to be talking about Churchill.
Yes.
But yeah, the German Navy, they made all these movies like in the 1950s that tried to say, we didn't have any ships as powerful as the Bismarck and what have you. Well, the ship that ruined the Bismarck was HMS Rodney. And HMS Rodney had 9 16-inch guns as opposed to the 8 15-inch guns on the Bismarck. And she went in really close and bloody well destroyed her in about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Royal Navy didn't have to fear the German Navy. Churchill's whole thing in 1940 of the Germans are going to invade, it was nonsense. Even if the Luftwaffe had managed to defeat the RAF in the Battle of Britain, the RAF could simply have withdrawn north of London, and the German Me-109 fighters, or Bf-109 fighters as they were at that time, they could spend about 5 minutes over London. So if the RAF had withdrawn north of London, the Germans simply couldn't have escorted bombers further than that.
Yeah, indeed.
And there was no chance whatsoever of Germany invading Britain in 1940. The Royal Navy was vastly more powerful than the German Navy. And at night, the Luftwaffe, even if they had air superiority, which they never got, but even if they had it, They couldn't have done anything at night
Yeah.
to Royal Navy ships. So any German troops who did manage to get ashore would have been cut off the first
Yeah.
night and the second night. There would have been no
100%.
supplies, no ammunition, no nothing coming to them.
Yeah. And
it was a pure myth.
And the
Germany
Luftwaffe
could
wouldn't have
invade.
had the capacity to aerial supply an invasion force of that size as well.
Not a chance. Not a chance.
And an invasion was the entire justification that Churchill gave in all of his speeches for continuing the war. Every single sacrifice the British people made was all about a direct invasion. It wasn't about Poland. It wasn't about Austria. It wasn't about the Low Countries or France or Alsace-Lorraine.
Land or whatever,
Yeah, exactly. It was about a direct invasion. You know, like think about Churchill's most famous speech. And I got to admit, knowing what I know now,
beaches.
Exactly. First of all, I got to be honest. He sounds a bit tipsy when when I listen back to the recordings. You know, fight on the beaches. Knowing about his lifestyle now, he sounds. I'm sorry, but he just sounds like he's had a shandy. But then on top of that, it's just nonsense. There wasn't going to be any beaches. It wasn't going to be in the fields.
It was never going. The idea that Britain was threatened with invasion in 1940 is a total lie. The Germans were planning, if you want to put it like this, to pull Rhine barges across the English Channel by tugs and fishing boats.
Wow!
And a British destroyer at 35 knots would have probably sunk most of them just with its wake.
Yeah.
It was an utter nonsense. It was never going to happen. And if you listen to AH's speeches at the same time, they were all asking for peace.
And just to be clear, what that peace would have looked like.
Hitler made it very clear he was always going east. If Britain and France had not interfered with his invasion of Poland, I'm quite convinced he would never have fought Britain and France.
Well, what would have happened if, first of all, if Germany got Danzig? It would have been the exact same as in 1935 when the Saarland, which is a similarly sized region to Danzig, that was entirely German, but that was much more economically important and strategically important for the iron and very important for military stuff. And what happened? The Germans annexed it with about 95% of the vote, and nothing happened. Absolutely nothing happened to the geopolitical situation. And so on top of that, like in peace in 1940, what would it have been? Because one of my pet peeves is whenever they talk about the question with Halifax, for example, and in a cabinet meeting is, do we surrender or do we not? And I have a big problem with that word because that was just not what was on the table at all.
No, it wasn't. Absolutely
literally
correct.
Peace. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been peace. Would Germany maybe have asked for some of its colonies in Africa back, but actually Hitler wasn't really interested even in those, from what he said.
Yeah.
There's
Alsace-Lorraine, and that's about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's I just want to go back to about the invasion, but I have to ponder on it for a second. Just because you've mentioned about the colonies, there was, I believe, an association. It's in because Hitman and I did 2 parts on Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck's My Reminiscences of Africa. And
excellent campaign. He was never actually defeated, even though he was vastly outnumbered.
Exactly, like nearly 10-1, and it's a fabulous book. Firstly, and secondly, his campaign is probably the most astonishing feat of arms in the 20th century, all things considered. And but anyway, after the war, because he technically surrendered, I think it was 1 or 2 days after Germany itself had surrendered the empire. But he was a part of some kind of like colonial sort of remembrance or some kind of colonial celebratory society in Germany, sort of like veterans of the colonial wars, settlers, pioneers, people who lived in Southwest Africa, Tanganyika, Togo, those sort of places, and they'd sort of talk about it was partly social, partly cultural, this organization.
And apparently, when because I think I remember reading this in Christopher Clark's book Iron Kingdom, that when they came to power in 33, from 33 into 34, they made overtures to the NSDAP, and they were firmly rebuffed. The NSDAP basically had very little stomach or concern about Germany's lost colonies, which actually turned people like von Lettow-Vorbeck not against the regime per se, but had them on quite unfriendly terms, which is an interesting little quirk when you sort of listen to like the narrative about old world domination. It's just like, yeah, they weren't even concerned about their own colonies that much.
Furious. You may know this more than me, but I'm pretty sure that von Lettow-Vorbeck was he was pretty much a royalist imperialist type of guy.
Yeah, he was. Yeah,
very much like
devoted monarchist.
Yeah, very much like the guy who wrote Storm of Steel.
Yeah, Ernst Junger.
Yeah. He was that sort of a bloke. And Ernst Junger was another guy who was not a big supporter, or they wanted to make him a supporter of the National Socialists, but he was not keen at all.
Yeah, exactly. And about the we're talking about the invasion as before, and it's one of those things that the only little bit of hope that Germany did have is that at the outbreak of war, because you mentioned about German rearmament and how Churchill overestimated Luftwaffe strength. Of the three arms, the Luftwaffe was arguably the most well furnished and probably the most modern in terms of its capabilities. You got to think, the outbreak of the war, they had the BF or ME 109, they had the Junkers Yuma 87, the Stuka, they had all kinds of advanced bombers, the Heinkel 111. Although these were only two engines.
The Stuka, you have to say though, the Ju 87 was a sitter for fighters. They had to withdraw
it was a sitter.
They had to withdraw it from the Battle of Britain because they had such heavy losses.
It was a turkey shoot for them, yeah. But like for its intended purpose, the Junkers 87 was a fantastic, close air support aircraft.
If the Germans had air superiority, yeah.
Correct, sure. Exactly. But the point I'm making is the Luftwaffe was a very, very advanced air force, and the only hope they would have had is to neutralize the Navy. But even then, the principle remains. But that's what I'm saying. But even if they had succeeded, the Germans didn't have enough assets to support any landing. So I'm just sort of supporting a hypothesis that, even in the most optimistic scenario for the Axis, there's essentially no way.
All I want to point out is that in 1940. The Fleet Air Arm, the British Naval Air Force, had plans to attack enemy ports like Taranto, right? And they had the right aircraft to do it with, and they had the torpedoes to do it with. The German Air Force in 1940 did not have good torpedo aircraft. They just didn't. So the only thing
the Germans didn't have great torpedoes either.
Well, and not initially, that's true, but although not as bad as the American ones at the start of the war. But the point is, in 1940, they got torpedo aircraft later on, but in 1940, the Germans had no real torpedo aircraft, so the only thing they could do to warships was to high-level bomb them, and they couldn't use their Stukas because they were useless if there were any fighters around. But so they had to high-level bomb warships, and high-level bombing warships with bombs that were at sea and moving around was always pretty damn useless.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
half the time the warships could avoid the bombs.
Yeah, I was going to say it's very, very difficult to even carpet bomb a navy. It just doesn't quite work. Ships are too slender. In essence,
they move too fast, and from high level, the bomb sights just weren't accurate enough to do it. And also, of course, you're going to be fired at by all the warship's guns as well. So yeah.
Sorry, it just occurred to me. Iron Duke, I remembered the point about the invasion force, and I was, you know how I said I forgot it. Sorry, it just occurred to me, and we might touch on this later because it is actually controversies of Churchill's. But I was wondering if you had remembered Case Anton, and if you've got to talk about the French Navy after their capitulation, because that's quite a controversy of Churchill's. And
you're talking about when Churchill forces the Royal Navy, much against their will, to attack the French Navy in port.
In North Africa, and Admiral Darlan, who was in negotiations with both parties to sort of surrender the fleet however he could. Because you got to think, if the Germans had access to the French fleet, and if the Germans had combined even a portion of the French fleet with the Italian fleet, that does change the dynamic of the sea war substantially.
A little bit, but bear in mind, in 1940, the French fleet, they had two battle cruisers, I suppose you'd call them, with 13.5-inch guns. They were pretty good ships, but their other battleships were not very good World War I holdovers. They're two good ships, the Jean Bart, and I can't remember what the other one's called, were eventually refitted in America and fought in the Far East against the Japanese and were good ships. But one of them wasn't even armed in 1940. And the French Navy always said, if the Germans occupy the unoccupied bit of France, we'll sink our ships rather than let the Germans take them. And in fact, they did do that when Germany did that in 1943, I think it was. They did do that. They sculled the ships. And what I can tell you, because I'm into naval history, is the British admirals and captains in command didn't want to attack the French. They didn't want to. They were forced to by Churchill. Like Churchill said, do it or I'll sack you, basically.
Yeah, he forced their hand, overrode the commander's misgivings, you might say.
Yeah, the British commanders definitely did not want to attack the French. But, to me, it's so typical that we were talking, Mr. Streets, before the stream, about Churchill's insane idea of an Anglo-French union in 1940.
Oh, absolutely.
And within months, he'd gone to, okay, we're going to attack the French fleet and kill hundreds of French sailors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all about the British Empire. And now you're talking about setting up a whole different country called the Anglo-French Union.
England, France.
And I think there's two separate points here. One, I just want to talk about attacking the French fleet. There's this incredible sort of theme of Churchill where if you're losing, escalate. And if you're losing, widen the war, open up a new front, attack a new country. And for example, there's so many examples in the early war where he's easily willing to expand the war by going into new countries, including violating the neutrality of those countries. The classic example,
Norway.
Yep, Norway, and also Iran as well. And the one time I do appreciate that Iceland, and the one time he doesn't push for this, and I do appreciate he's Lord of the Admiralty and he wouldn't have much say in here, is Belgium. He was like, yeah, let's just have it neutral, and there's no way the Germans are going to do exactly what they did before. And he's willing to violate neutrality of all these other countries, but not force Belgium to reinforce their lands.
He might have learned his lesson from World War I when he larped as the commander of a Royal Navy division on land in Antwerp. So, which we talked about on the last stream. But anyway, he was never really in command of it, but he larped as the commander. But which Churchill was very fond of doing, look at his RAF uniforms and all the other uniforms he wore during the war, none of which he was entitled to wear, but never mind. But yeah, I feel like we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, although I've also seen somebody in the chat asking about HMS Hood versus Bismarck, which I will talk about in a minute, but not yet because it's a bit ahead of where we are. The thing is, the Royal Navy fairly quickly swept up most of the German merchant fleet, as was always going to happen, and dominated the oceans. The Royal Navy, as I said briefly earlier, had been planning for a war that would start at the end of 1941, roughly speaking. Never got there, of course, because the British government was so dumb. And the Royal Navy also wanted something else. They thought the British government would be intelligent enough not to make Germany, Italy, and Japan fight Britain at the same time. Britain, at a pinch, at sea, could have fought any two of those nations. The Royal Navy was big enough to do that. It wasn't big enough to fight all three at once. It just wasn't. And, you know, it might have been in 1919, but it wasn't in 1939, 1940.
The interesting point there, Andrew. I'm not disagreeing with you. I get what you're saying, and you're largely correct. But I do wonder if, because I mean, we get a little taste of this, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves just so we're talking about Navy stuff. So just to touch on the point that when we see the fate of Prince of Wales and Repulse in Singapore, we do see that the British are essentially adhering to the previous war's naval doctrine, whereas the Japanese with sophisticated air aviation.
No, I've got to disagree with you, mate. Churchill was. The Admiral, he wasn't. Yeah. But we'll get on to this, and
will get onto that.
I'll explain what I mean by that.
All I was going to say is I would love to have seen how the Royal Navy would have gone toe-to-toe with, say, the Japanese Navy in the way that they did against the Americans. But, I mean, probably another chat for another stream. But I wanted to put that question to you because I was kind of curious because, obviously, Anglo-Saxon did mention Hood versus Bismarck. But anyway, my intellectual curiosity took me there.
Britain did have a plan for this, and it was to take a port in China called Weihai Wei and use that as an advanced base.
Okay.
And if Britain had ended up just fighting Japan, which from about the late 1920s onwards was what the Royal Navy was really looking at, because Germany had a navy back then, and Italy was not an enemy. That was their plan. And I think Britain probably would have won that war, given the Royal Navy was considerably larger than the Japanese Navy. But anyway, it's taking us way off topic. If you want to watch some stuff on that, I can say there's an excellent naval history channel on YouTube by a guy called Dr. Alexander Clark with an E. And it's a very good naval history channel, but it is a naval history channel. And if you want to know about Royal Navy plans to fight Japan and basically anything the Royal Navy was planning in the 20s and 30s, go and watch Dr. Alexander Clark's channel. It's a good channel. He's a bit of a liberal, as so many people are today.
Aren't they all?
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, he's got two nice dogs. So there we go. But
Winston.
Yeah, you know, I if someone likes dogs, I always give them a benefit of the doubt. But
if we can cleave back to the main point, right, Andrew, which is obviously the invasion of Poland, right, which is where we tangent off to, is that one thing we have to keep in mind is that there was actually, I hazard to call them a pro-peace party, but there was a segment of Polish, the government, certainly of the Polish, political structure and of their society, who were actually quite content to bargain with the Germans regarding the status of the Polish corridor in West Prussia. And what we see is the intervention of the British and the French to torpedo that plan, which, as we know and as our viewers will know, has a very, very eerie comparison to our modern day. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, need I say any more?
Yeah.
But that there could have been a solution that could have saved a whole lot of bloodshed and could have resolved, you might say, a grievance which affected, in fairness, both parties. And instead of that, the pro-war interventionists got their way, and Poland was thrown under the bus, much in the way that Ukraine was thrown under the bus in this recent instance.
As we're seeing to this very day.
As we're seeing this very day, and that is a perspective that is very, very rarely touched on, because even amongst the leadership of the Reich, there were a great number of people, particularly in the Abwehr and even in the German High Command, who actually were quite guarded and even anxious about the precipitation of a wider conflict with the Western Allies, the French and British.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Particularly in the German army as well.
Yeah.
The German army weren't dead keen on a world war,
Particularly individuals such as General Halder, von Brauchitsch. There were a number of them, particularly in that sort of that higher echelon of the Prussian officer class, who did not want the outbreak of a wider world war.
I've got I'll ask Mr. Streets to come in on this in a sec, but I also think it's correct to say that initially, when the National Socialists took power, which they did fairly democratically, it has to be said, but when they did, their initial idea was to make Poland an ally against the Soviet Union. That's my reading of the history anyway. That initially, yes, Germany wanted Danzig back, and they certainly wanted access across the corridor to East Prussia, which makes absolute sense. But their initial idea was to make, because the Poles obviously had defeated the Soviet invasion in 1920, was to make Poland
under Joseph Pilsudski,
Yeah, the initial German idea when AH took power was to make Poland an ally against the Soviets.
Well, including with Pilsudski himself.
Yeah. That's my point, Mr. Ritz, is that, there was no real, yes, Germany obviously wanted access to East Prussia, which is perfectly understandable. It's a part of Germany, for God's sake. But if Poland had not been so pig-headed, they could have ended up as German allies.
Well, they had a non-aggression pact in 1934. And basically, it looked for a time that there was going to be an accommodation between the two. But what basically happened is that it was a combination of arrogance and being duped by the Western Allies. That being said, I have to say, I can't, just as I can see the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, say if Operation Barbarossa hadn't happened, most people think there would have been some kind of conflict at some point. I can't really see Hitler permanently settling for an allied Poland. I think at a bare minimum, it would be a sort of relationship like the Romanians or the Hungarians.
We sell for those for the whole of the war, basically.
Yeah.
So, the other thing about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is it was a response because Britain and France very, very slowly and very half-heartedly, because Chamberlain genuinely did detest the Soviets, tried to get an alliance with Russia far too late, far too little. And you know, the Germans just went in there and cut Britain and France off at the pass, basically.
Well, we had nothing to offer, and really the time to make an accommodation with Russia against Germany was during the Munich crisis, because the Soviets were one of the only major power that continued to guarantee Czechoslovakia during the Munich Agreement, which, of course, the Soviets weren't part of.
Although, of course, the Czechs were extremely reluctant to accept Soviet help because they realized what that would probably mean. But yeah, fair enough.
And so, you know, you have some amazing quotes from Churchill this time. So, for example, May 7th, 1938, Sudeten Germans were the best treated minority in Europe. And just some other, you know,
a dubious claim at best, I would say.
I know, it really is. It really is incredible. Now, it's quite interesting. Another one from 1938 to the Soviet envoy Maishki, who's basically the Soviet ambassador to Britain. And during the so-called wilderness years, Churchill's constantly this right-wing imperialist figure, allegedly, is constantly talking. He's the number one opponent of communism, and he wanted to arm the Germans in 1919 against them, and all this sort of stuff. He is talking constantly with the Soviet ambassador, just asking his opinions, that sort of thing, and throughout the whole Munich crisis. Here's a great quote from 1938. Again, Stalin is a solid and reliable fellow. He keeps his word. That's from 1938. That's not during the Alliance of Convenience when they're desperate against Germany. That's before the war. It's before the war. Now, I know that Hitler himself said Stalin is a man I can do business with. Exactly. But, you know, it's kind of like you're asking... he did organize a funeral service in Berlin for Pilsudski. Absolutely. And Pilsudski wanted an accommodation with him throughout his entire career. It was always the Russians who were the big problem for the Poles, not the Germans. But anyway, back to the why is this right-wing anti-communist constantly talking to the Soviet ambassador and advice?
Got nothing to do with the focus group, of course.
Exactly. And of course, it's literally the same people. And so it's kind of funny. If Bo was on this stream, I would have brought this up because this is a classic, you know, this is the right-wing figure getting permission from what to do from a left-wing unelected official, which is exactly what happened to Bo in the last election with Hope Not Hate and all that stuff. But I mean, history does rhyme, and
it doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme.
Yeah. And here's another great quote from Churchill. Hitler is aiming to create a Central European bloc from Germany to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. In 4 or 5 years, this is the time of Anschluss, in 4 or 5 years, he'll be able to realize his dream if he isn't stopped in time. So from there, what's the big threat from Germany? A Central European bloc from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean.
Why does Britain care about that?
Exactly. That's the big threat if we don't stop it. Basically a trading bloc. I mean, that's it.
Well, I mean, what's Britain's interest in
the calamity, you know?
Yeah, literally.
Britain's interest in Central Europe is very limited.
And on top of that, if France wasn't willing to help, there's just no way of backing them up other than siding with the Soviets.
And also, like, you know, France in the 30s, late 1930s, tended to follow Britain. Like, if Britain had not given a guarantee to Poland, I'm pretty sure France wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm. Like France was very set on the helping the Czechs, but the Poles is a totally different question because, for example, the French had a good relationship with the Lithuanians. They were the ones who basically helped Lithuania take over Memel in the 1920, wherever it was, after Versailles. And so the Poles were so erratic, they had caused a lot of consternation and distrust among the allies in Europe because it's like, who are these guys? They're trying to create their own empire and they're pretending that they're a world power. It just caused a lot of distrust. But then all of a sudden, we gave them a blank check to do whatever they want.
Yep, totally agree. Totally agree. Furious, what are you? Anything to say on this before we move on a bit?
No, not really. The only thing I would add is that I suppose we probably touch on this because we're obviously the intent is get to the end of the war. But if you look, all I'm going to say to our viewers is because I mean, obviously, most of our friends and viewers and whatever are history buffs, but take a look at a map of Poland in 1938 and a map of Poland in 1948, 10 years apart. And you'll notice that even though Poland was technically, and when I say innocent party, I mean, obviously Poland found itself, at the being the recipient of overtures from France and Britain, and was sort of, given empty guarantees by the British and the French, and eventually decided to stand against the armies of Germany. Poland fell, etc. But for the most part, it is right to call Poland something of an innocent party, and despite the fact that Polish, although one will cite the Bromberg massacres, and that was what sort of did to some degree tip Hitler in towards committing to the war, and sending his troops eastwards. But in essence, Polish troops did not cross into German territory. The Poles, they didn't invade the Soviets, they didn't invade the Germans. And yet, at the negotiation table, the Western Allies were more than happy to see Poland not only territorially severed, but then to fall behind the Iron Curtain, which just goes to show you just how disposable Poland was in the greater scheme of the war. This claim that, as you guys have rightly said, Poland was hardly even referenced in speeches, past a certain point. And in the wider sort of broad scheme of it, if you really think about it, the war was ostensibly started for the benefit of Poland and Polish independence.
Much good it did them.
And indeed, much good it did them. And look at their fate, a very, very tragic one.
I think, to be fair, because I do try and be fair, in late 1944, Churchill finally started to realize this. But by that stage, the alliance between FDR and Stalin had basically pushed him out, and he was very much a third wheel by that time.
Yeah, the junior partner of the triumvirate. Yeah,
absolutely,
very much so.
He was. Yeah. So, but yeah, the Britain went to war over Poland, and totally and completely failed Poland. Like these days, you will hear left-wingers and liberals trying to say, "Oh, we went to war because of the Jews," or whatever it was. But that was actually absolute nonsense.
It's literally a collision course, a geostrategic collision course between Germany and Britain, more or less.
Pushed by people like Churchill, but yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
But just pure nonsense. Anyway, just to get us back on course, eventually Chamberlain feels he has to bring Churchill back into the British government, and he comes back in as First Lord of the Admiralty, which is the political head of the Royal Navy. It's not the professional head at all. And the Royal Navy sent a message out to all its ships saying Winston's back. And traditionally, people say that's because the Royal Navy was happy. Although many other people say it was a warning because of all the fuck-ups that Churchill had done with the Royal Navy in World War
All
One.
Winston's little mishaps.
Yeah, that killed
Yeah.
hundreds of Royal Navy sailors. But yeah,
Mhm.
and never a lot. So some people actually think it was the Royal Navy being a bit memey and actually saying, "Oh God, Winston's back." And the first thing he does is he stops all British capital ship, all works on British capital ships, which is to say battleships and aircraft carriers, basically, in favor of an emergency program of escort ships, small escort ships for convoys, which would make some sense, except that in 1938, the Royal Navy, the Admiralty, had already instituted an emergency program of small escort ships, and they were already being built in Britain and had been for the last 18 months. And I'm talking about a really big program, Flower class corvettes, escort destroyers, all this stuff. The Royal Navy was already doing it. And when you do something like that to dockyards and shipyards, what you're doing is you're having to move very skilled shipbuilders of various ranks from one shipyard to another. And for a period of a couple of months, nothing's going to happen. And then gradually you're going to start building the new vessels, and the old vessels will just be left. And what this resulted in, and it was a disastrous move by Winston Churchill, none of Winston Churchill's emergency ships were actually commissioned until 1943, by which time the U-boat threat was largely defeated. There was always,
the Kriegsmarine had stopped sorting for about 18 months by that point.
yeah, absolutely. But the U-boats had largely been defeated by the middle of 1943. I mean, they were always a threat. They always sank ships, but by and large, they weren't the
existential crisis that beset Britain by the U-boats was more or less overcome by mid-1942, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so by the time these Churchill emergency ships actually started getting commissioned, they weren't particularly needed. But what that meant was that in terms of battleships, only one British battleship was actually finished after the fire of King George V's, and that was HMS Vanguard, and she was not finished in time for the war, even against Japan. And even more importantly, all the British aircraft carriers were delayed by a minimum of 6 months, and sometimes almost a year, so that, for example, when HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse were sent at Churchill's insistence to Singapore, the Admiralty said, "No, don't send those ships, Prime Minister," but Churchill ignored them, as he so often did. They were supposed to get an aircraft carrier escort. The only aircraft carrier available, unfortunately, ran aground, and so had to go for repairs. And because of Churchill's stopping of
was that Ark Royal, or was that a separate carrier?
No, it was a different carrier. I think it might have been Victorious, but I can't remember now. But it was one of the wartime British armored carriers.
Yeah.
But she ran aground and had to go to get repairs. And because Churchill had stopped all British carrier work on aircraft carriers, as soon as he became First Lord of the Admiralty, there was no other carrier available to go with them. And it is pretty certain that had there been one aircraft carrier with, say, Sea Hurricanes on board, the unescorted Japanese bombers, torpedo bombers that attacked Prince of Wales and Repulse, probably would have gotten broken up enough they wouldn't have sunk them. But there we go. another Churchill
or
disaster.
at least interceded enough, because in the end, if torpedo bombers and naval dive bombers have free run at ships and all they have to do is face ground fire, which, not to make light of it, that's still a danger for a naval aviator.
Yes, it
But
is.
it does remove an entire dimension of defensive flying away from them, and they can focus strictly on the ship rather than having to fight for air superiority.
And bear in mind, Furius, that the Japanese torpedo bombers that attacked Prince of Wales and repulsed, they were at the absolute edge of their range, so they had no spare fuel to do maximum power and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And they were twin-engined medium bombers with no armor and no fire escort. They would have found it very hard to have won in that situation. But to go backwards a little bit, Churchill was entirely willing to violate Norway's neutrality in 1940, but it actually, like, the British Army and the French Army had a disaster in Norway. They didn't manage to do what they wanted to do at all. But the Royal Navy did very well in Norway. There were like a dozen German destroyers off Narvik, and Britain first of all sent, I don't know, 4 or 5 destroyers there and damaged some German ships. But then we sent HMS Wasp, a battleship, in there with another 6 big destroyers, tribals, and sank all 10 German destroyers, which was half the German destroyer force. Like, Britain had about, I don't know, in 1940, probably 180 destroyers. Germany had like 20, and we sank 10 of them in Narvik.
Yeah. In essentially a sortie, yeah.
But, someone asked me earlier, and I'll talk about it now because I'll forget about it, HMS Hood versus Bismarck. Hood was always supposed to go in for a refit and up-armoring, and it was never done because she was the biggest ship in the Royal Navy and very famous, and they never got around.
And they chanced it. They thought she was tough enough.
Yeah, and to be honest, her sinking was an accident. If that German shell had landed anywhere else, it wouldn't have exploded in our magazine. It was luck.
It was a fluke shot. Like, not to take away the skill of German gunnery, because even in World War One, the German
it was accurate gunnery. It was, yes.
Yeah.
It was accurate
to the Germans' credit, in both World Wars, the German naval gunnery was exceptional. But needless to say, given Hood's dimensions, even though she didn't have her refit, that single shot by Bismarck was an absolute fluke shot. Like you say, that shell could have landed 2 or 3 feet in a separate direction, or had 5 more degrees 100%. Of deflection, and missed the magazine and not detonated her. But that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it was pure bad luck for the guys on Hood. 2,000 guys basically killed in a nanosecond. I think there were 3 survivors.
It was less than half a dozen. It was an absolute catastrophe for the Royal Navy. Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why the Royal Navy was absolutely determined to kill Bismarck, and indeed did. But yeah, Bismarck did not survive very long after that. But anyway. So that's what I say to Anglo-Saxon in the chat on that one. All right. So the funny thing is that Neville Chamberlain resigns over what happens in Norway. And most of what happened in Norway was Churchill's fault, because he was the guy who was planning it. But somehow or other, Chamberlain gets the blame, and Churchill takes over as Prime Minister and heads a government which is supposedly a national government, but was overwhelmingly socialist, it has to be said. Wasn't a conservative government by any means. And then starts his career in World War II where he has even more disasters than he did in World War One. France. We've already briefly talked about his ridiculous idea of a union between Britain and France, which was never going to happen. The British Army chucked out from Europe, saved by the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy saved the British Army in Norway. It then goes and saves the British Army from Dunkirk. Churchill then sends another force further south into France, which again the Royal Navy has to go and save the surviving remnants of. Basically, the first part of World War II is the British Army being sent somewhere by Churchill, and then the Royal Navy losing sailors and very good warships to go and rescue them when it all goes wrong, as it invariably does. We have the whole Battle of Britain stuff. We've already talked about that a bit. Like, the Germany had no chance whatsoever of invading Britain in 1940. It was purely Churchill propaganda that claimed they did.
Mm-hmm. No chance and no desire.
I don't think the Germans even wanted to do it, to be honest. It was never really a serious plan. And the German Navy just straight up said, look, you can't do this, guys. We don't have enough warships.
And it's interesting, by the way, with the actual the appointment of Churchill, because basically Chamberlain says, let's continue, and the Labour Party says, not with you. We can take an official Conservative as the Prime Minister, but it's not you. And with Halifax and Churchill as the two options, the Labour Party go with Churchill, even though he's the guy, as you talked about in the last stream, viciously breaking up striking workers in the 1920s. And doing many things that you'd think a socialist would despise. But the Labour Party want Churchill in, and sure enough, Attlee, the Labour Party leader,
the vile Labour Party leader, yeah.
He was allegedly also taking these focus group payments.
Well, I'm sure that's true. It wouldn't surprise me in the least degree. I'm no fan of Attlee, but
and it really is an establishment as well. Attlee and Churchill have the same nanny.
Oh, look, Attlee was a World War One British Army officer. He was not a working class guy. Also, Churchill was never really a conservative. He wasn't. This is one of the things that that History Bro was bringing out last week. Churchill was never a natural conservative. He was a liberal.
Absolutely. So yeah, getting on to the sort of after the Battle of Britain, we started off the stream talking about if Churchill's rearmament calls had taken place, we would have had a lot of outdated planes. What do you think about the bases for destroyers deal?
Oh, it was appalling. I mean, first of all, the Royal Navy were getting more and more escort ships coming online almost every week. The ships that the Americans sold to Britain were basically late World War One destroyers, not very maneuverable, and I don't think any of them were even commissioned into the Royal Navy. I think the quickest any of them managed to be commissioned was about 9 or 10 months, because they'd been basically mothballed since 1919. They were useless. The most useful one was the one that Britain used filled with explosives in the bow and rammed into the Saint-Nazaire dock, which was the only dock in France which was big enough to take Tirpitz or Bismarck. and destroyed it. But the ship was destroyed when it did that. That was the most useful of those 50 destroyers. They were not needed whatsoever. And Churchill took them just because he was trying to drag America into the war, basically.
Absolutely. And just the context of that, the territory taken by America, assuming those bases in Bermuda and Newfoundland.
Many of which they still have, by the way.
Absolutely. That is more land taken from us than Germany ever asked for in World War II from Britain. It was always going to be a white peace with the British Empire. They'd take land from France, perhaps some from Belgium, and certainly in the east. But literally, those couple of square meters or kilometers represents more than was ever asked for in the 1940 peace terms.
Indeed.
And so, yeah, I mean, Furius, what do you think about the other bits, for example, in the Mediterranean? Again, I think it's so important, politically needing a win, which is why I think Churchill did a lot of stuff around Libya before Rommel came in. Yeah, I mean, any thoughts about the early Mediterranean War after the fall of France?
Well, also let's keep in mind with the collapse of France in like a 6-week campaign, which I actually mentioned how Vollentin-Vorbeck's East Africa campaign is one of the greatest feats of arms of the 20th century. I also am of the view that was it Case White, Fulvais, the attack on France? I can't remember exactly, but the Snickelschnitt, the sickle cut through the Ardennes, is probably one of the most audacious military plans of modern history. The idea of driving tanks through a forest that the Allies considered impenetrable around a massive fortifications that the French spent literal percentages of their GDP to build, that being the Maginot Line, of course.
Yeah.
And totally unhinging. Well, firstly, they're attacking the north against the Belgians and Dutch to feint the attack north, and then driving through, with Army Group with Army Group B, I think, in the middle, and and then Rommel crossing the Sudan and driving towards the Channel, to the point where sort of even before he reached Africa, Rommel was almost starting to become mythologized. Then they called the 7th Panzer Division the Ghost Division, and at one point in time, I believe,
although Furious, he got a bit of a scare during the British counterattack at Amiens.
He most certainly did. At Arras, yes, he most certainly did.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, that counterattack was led by none other than Mr. Charles de Gaulle.
Yep.
Well, and a lot of British Matilda tanks, but
Yes. Who fought with great courage. The broad point I was making, just to answer yourself, Mr. Streets, was that and after that sort of campaign happened, and of course at the very, very end, Mussolini joins in. What does he say? All I need is a few thousand casualties, and I can sit at the table of negotiations of a man who's fought. Little did Mussolini realize that the war wouldn't actually end. The British were, certainly under Churchill, intent to fight on. And where was the only place that the Commonwealth could fight the Axis? Well, that was obviously in North Africa, between Egypt and Libya, in what we call Cyrenaica.
I'm sure Furious, that the Italians even sent some aircraft to take part in the Battle of Britain.
Yes, a token force.
Yeah,
and
which is worth mentioning, actually.
Please.
Yes.
Sorry.
No. Sorry, what were you saying, Streets?
I was just going to say, not that it strategically matters, but they also launched an offensive into Somaliland and take it.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
The British had to evacuate. But let me move this on a little bit, guys. And so O'Connor did this brilliant offensive. He had 33,000 troops, mostly British, but a few Indians and later on some Australians. And he defeated an Italian army of almost 200,000 men. As I said earlier, the Western Desert Force, as it was then known, they were regular soldiers, and they were probably the best trained soldiers in the British Army. And they did. They were regular pre-war dudes, very well trained. They had Matilda tanks, and the Matilda tank was so strongly armored that the Italians literally had no anti-tank gun that could penetrate their armor.
And the Italian tanks were useless against it for the same reason.
Yeah, exactly. The 2-pounder, to be fair, in 1941, which the Matilda was armed with, was a pretty good 40mm anti-tank gun that could penetrate even most German tanks at that stage.
Yeah. Well, think of it. You got to think that the undergunned Panzer III used to battle with the Matilda. Like, it wasn't until they upgunned the Panzer III that it could actually fight the Matilda.
As a 37, when it had a 37mm gun, it struggled, but then it got a 50mm gun, and then it was able to penetrate the Matilda.
Exactly.
But the Italians in 1940 had no, they had no gun that could penetrate that. You hear stories of like Matilda tanks with British and Australian infantry behind them going into Italian forts, and the Italian general will be out there firing a submachine gun and get killed. You can't say the Italians weren't brave, because they bloody well were. A general firing a submachine gun at a tank is pretty brave, but it ain't going to do him much good,
No. Well, what's that old airborne analogy that like bullets bounce off tanks, literally speaking?
Yeah, exactly. But the Italians had no answer to things like the Matilda, and as I said, they were facing the best trained British force there was. But just as O'Connor and the Western Desert Force are almost in a position to basically take over the whole of Italian East Africa, Winston Churchill, in his wisdom, decides that he's going to take away the best parts of this force and send them to Greece.
Oh, imagine that.
Yeah. And the thing is, the British intelligence services told Churchill that Germany can send anything up to 15 or 16 divisions into Greece if she wants to. In fact, I think she only sent 12, but she could send 15 or 16.
But many elite units were sent, though. You think they had German paratroopers,
and
the Grossdeutschland division there. I mean,
yeah, and these were troops who'd fought in Poland and fought in France, so they were experienced soldiers. But the point I want to make here, Furius, is that Britain sent an Australian division, a New Zealand division, and a good British armoured brigade, right?
Correct, yeah.
So 2.5 divisions, let's say, for the sake of simplicity. Now, even if they were the best troops that God had ever seen, 2.5 divisions can't beat 12 divisions. They just can't.
No.
And as you rightly say, these were not shit German divisions. They were good German divisions. So rather than cleaning up Italian North Africa, which would have meant the whole desert war backwards and forwards for the next 2.5 years wouldn't have happened, no Africa Corps, etc.
Well, O'Connor essentially had a clean run, if not all the way to Tripoli, then at least halfway across Libya itself, without any impediment. Yeah.
And he was just, Wavell, his commander, was told, no, you got to stop him by Churchill. And Churchill gets this brilliant idea that 2.5 British Commonwealth divisions can somehow defeat 12 German divisions. somehow.
Mm.
It's insane.
Yeah, it is lunacy. Yeah,
And so obvious, and also almost no RAF that can support them. So the Germans and the Italians quickly get air superiority. And there's a load of Italian troops there too, which I'm not even counting. So they make up for the Greek guys. And you've got
and let's keep in mind too. So sorry, not to interrupt. I apologise, Eindrich, but let's keep in mind too. The Greeks have been fighting a very, very stubborn and determined defence for months in Epirus and in Western Greece. And at this point, they're already feeling depleted. They're lacking ammunition. The Greeks are brave, but they're tired.
And lack armour and all sorts of other things and air support. But yeah, absolutely correct, Furius. Totally true.
And to quote Churchill himself, as he said in the House of Commons, the Greeks do not fight like heroes. Heroes fight like Greeks, which I thought was very apt, actually.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? The 300 Spartans didn't win. But anyway, but yeah, it's the insanity that 2.5 Commonwealth and British divisions can beat 12 German divisions. It's beyond me.
Yeah.
So what happens?
One of many of Churchill's miscalculations, strategically speaking and operationally speaking.
And of course, this gives time for the Germans to send the Africa Corps to North Africa. While this,
which, if memory serves me correct, composed of 3 German divisions and I believe 4 or 5 Italian divisions. Yeah, because you had the German. What was it? The 12th Panzer that got sent down to Africa, and then they sort of basically cobbled together like 2 light motorized divisions, which eventually,
which one of which eventually became a Panzer division. I think it was the 21st and 15th Panzer divisions.
Actually, that's correct. Yeah, because one got sent initially, and then another one got sent. Yeah, it was 15 and 21st Panzer, but I think 15
and
might
then,
have been the first.
And then there was a light division on top of that.
99th Light Division. Yeah.
Yeah, and on top of that, the Italians had the Ariete and another armored division.
Centauro.
Yeah, and there
was the one that my grandfather fought in. Actually, he was in the 131st Centauro Division. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there were 2 Italian motorized divisions as well, and they were the main bit of
the Trieste Division and the.
Yeah, one of them was the Trieste. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can't remember the second one; just gone blank. But yeah,
but there were 2.
So basically, the majority of the reinforcements were actually like motorized or semi-motorized, if not armored. Yeah.
Yeah, and they could move quite quickly. And, because Rommel was Rommel, he immediately does a counterattack. But just to finish on the Greek thing, first of all, the Royal Navy has to go and rescue what's left of the Australians, New Zealanders, and British armour troops, although they can't rescue their tanks, of course, from Greece, and lose quite a lot of good ships and good sailors doing so. And then they take them to Crete, and in Crete, once again, the same thing happens again, and there's a hard battle, and the German airborne division it takes so many casualties that Hitler never uses it as an airborne division for an airborne drop again, just because they took.
It's essentially their last divisional landing. Like the Germans do partake in like small operations in 43, 44, but in terms of like a divisional operational mass landing, Crete is their final operation because of that debacle.
It's the last time a German airborne division is used as a whole division, just because they lost so many men. And the British and Australian and New Zealand troops narrowly lost, but once again, Royal Navy has to sail in there and under heavy air attack rescue the troops, which they do, of course. But they lose good ships and good sailors. And as we were saying just a minute earlier, in the meantime, the Africa Corps and Rommel have landed in Africa, and a war that could have been finished early in 1941 goes on for another 3 years.
Yeah, exactly. And Churchill sort of has a knack for this. It sort of tends to happen again that either his ideas are ill-conceived and wrong, or he strikes upon chance and has a win, shall I say, or a W as we call it, but then doesn't actually consolidate on that. He changes tack, something else gets his attention, and the O'Connor Africa-Greece affair is certainly an exemplar of that. Very much at the fore.
100%. And you guys, Mr. Streets, and also you, Furious, were talking earlier about all the distractions in the Middle East. Let's go and fight a war with Iran. Let's go and fight a war in Iraq. Blah, blah, blah. Which, the commander-in-chief of the British forces has to go and do all these wars with little extemporal forces. Like in Iraq, the British were even still using horsed cavalry in 1941.
Wow. Although I would say that would Turkey have been more likely to join the Axis if we hadn't have done anything in Syria or Iraq?
I don't think so, actually. I think the Turks had learned their lesson in World War One and weren't going to get involved. Whether Erdogan has now remains to be seen. But back then, I think they'd learned their lesson.
Well,
my answer...
Oh, sorry, Streets.
I was just going to say, my answer to that question is that in a hypothetical situation that Rommel captures Alexandria and takes the Suez, I believe the Germans would have strong-armed the Turks to join the Axis, because there actually was a pretty strong pro-Axis sentiment in Turkey. But I think
if they'd managed to take Suez, you might be right. But
yeah, but I think given
that close to that,
exactly, I think once the Rommel is halted at the first Battle of Alamein, and then the Afrika Korps and the German-Italian Panzer Army Africa is thrown back across Africa after the second Battle of Alamein, I would say that the Turks see the writing on the wall and opt for, as they did, essentially neutrality. Because the other thing is for the Germans as well is, and I mean, I've often said this, and say like myself and AM, we Apostolic Majesty, when we've talked about like, World War I, World War II history, hypotheticals, that sort of stuff, is that what if you look at like a world map, what do you see? You see that the northeastern part of Turkey, sort of corresponding with the Black Sea, the Pontic coast, where sort of Armenia is. I mean, Georgia's there today, but I mean, back then there was no Georgia; it was the Soviet Union. The Turks shared a border with the Soviet Union, and rather than the Germans having to go all the way around, the Ukraine, Donbass, the Crimea, the Caucasus, Baku from Trabzon is a few hundred kilometers. It would have totally transformed the Eastern Front War. So the ramifications for Rommel not prevailing in Egypt and reaching the Suez, and Turkey not joining the Axis, is actually quite profound when you think about it.
I think there's 2 points here, Furious. The first one is, after Rommel had essentially lost after the Second Alamein, he was heavily reinforced.
Yes, as the Germans tend to do from 1943 onwards, is they reinforce defeat. Yes.
If he'd have been reinforced prior to First Alamein, that might have made a difference. But I would just
or immediately after Tobruk,
Yeah, also true. But the same thing applies. What you got to look at when you're trying to reinforce Rommel, as the Germans, is that the Royal Navy was sinking half the supplies that Italy and Germany were sending in.
You read my mind exactly. The only problem with a reinforced Rommel in Egypt is that he had scant resources enough for the troops that he had. It would have been almost impossible to have fielded more forces, more divisions on the Egyptian border under present circumstances. The only way that would have been amended is if the Axis had resolved to capture Malta. But without the capture of Malta, there is no way.
I was just going to say, mate, if the Italian plan of dropping an Italian and a German airborne division.
Yeah, the Folgore and the Fallschirmjäger. Yeah.
And then reinforcing them by sea. If they'd have done that, maybe.
Yeah, because
I
there's
think
simply no way.
I think it would have been a hard fight.
It would have been a hard fight, but it would have been possible. The problem is with Malta and with the mass sinking of Axis supply vessels by both don't forget, also the Royal Navy did their fair share of sinking as well.
Well, that's just what I was going to say, is that there was a Royal Navy submarine flotilla based in Malta. Most of the time, there was a Royal Navy destroyer flotilla based in Malta that sank loads of Italian merchant ships trying to take supplies to Rommel.
Exactly.
But the only serious plan to solve that would have been to invade Malta, and of course Hitler was very leery of that because he remembered the Battle of Crete and how many casualties the Germans took there.
It's something that amongst Italian veterans was often talked about, and they actually said that the biggest mistake, well, not the biggest, but like in the context of this particular part of this discussion, like North Africa, the Mediterranean theater, because there are bigger mistakes made in World War II, right? But in terms of this topic specifically, the biggest mistake that the Axis make is not capturing Malta. And when you consider that, when you sort of calculate the amount of supplies that were sunk, the absolute strain the Axis forces suffered in Africa, particularly post the capture of Tobruk, once they advance into Egypt, their supply lines are so long. Meanwhile, I mean, what does because at this point, just for the sake of our viewers, who's in command in Africa? Well, this is where Monty comes into the picture, because he's replaced Auchinleck. Auchinleck, who was given command in Africa, Monty has replaced him, and Monty, being a more cautious World War, he was like Patton, like Rommel. Monty was a veteran of World War One and experienced pretty horrific, lived through pretty horrific experiences in the trenches, and so was naturally more cautious. But Monty,
I'm not a big fan, I have to say, of Montgomery.
Not many people are, and I'm not a fan of Monty either. But what did Monty do? He knew that Rommel was a master of maneuver warfare. He knew that he was dashing and he was tactically sort of agile. But Monty does not offer Rommel battle until he is ready. He builds up his supply of Grant tanks, of Shermans, of reinforced Matildas and Crusader tanks. He waits for the Indian reinforcements. He waits for the New Zealanders to arrive. He waits for all these reinforcements and for this new material and equipment to arrive. And then when Rommel's at the end of his strength, he then proceeds to engage in those two battles of Alamein. And particularly with the second one,
hang on, Furious. Yeah. Auchinleck won the first battle of Alamein when
that's true. Actually,
Rommel tried to rush him. Rommel tried to rush him, and Auchinleck, who had his faults, but he actually won the defensive first battle.
You're correct.
Which is much less famous than Montgomery.
The second one, exactly, and arguably a more difficult victory. Actually, not even arguably it was.
Yeah, but Montgomery had vastly bigger forces. 100% he did. But look, if you're going to ask me about best British generals in World War II, I'm going to talk about people like Bill Slim and O'Connor. I'm not going to talk about Montgomery.
And Horrocks is probably in for a shout as well.
Yeah, Horrocks was okay, I guess, but
he wasn't brilliant. I mean, Slim was brilliant, for instance.
He was.
I think Slim was the best British commander of World War II, to be honest with you, because he fought when he had almost nothing to fight with and almost no air support.
And Burma would have been a tough theatre, like at the best of times.
Yes. Yeah, Bill Slim was like a brilliant British World War II commander. But and he won the best British battle of World War II, which was Kohima, for God's sake. That was an entire Imperial Japanese division against a slightly reinforced British battalion, really. But
Would you call Monty's promotion a political appointment?
Yeah, for sure, because what Montgomery was able to do was to say to Churchill, no, because what Churchill did to his commanders constantly all through World War II was he would say, attack now. You've got 50,000 guys in the desert, but actually like 20,000 of those guys would be support troops who were not infantry or armor or artillery or engineers. They'd be guys driving trucks. And the thing about the Western Desert is the further you advanced, the longer your tail became, and the more trucks you needed to bring forward petrol, food, water, oil, lubricants, ammunition, all that stuff. And it worked for both sides. This is why Rommel was not able to win the First Battle of Alamein. His supply line was just too long. And this is why at least twice the war went backwards and forwards, because people would come to the end of their supply lines and just not be able to push on more.
Yeah. And in most cases, that was fuel and ammunition being the most critical.
Yeah, fuel, ammunition, water, food, lubricants, everything you need to fight, basically. And both sides were using each other's captured lorries and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, it was a weird war in some respects, because it wasn't fought in like sand dune desert. It was fought in scrubby plains with not much water and very few roads and almost no people. It was just a weird war. And it absorbed most of Britain's efforts for the first half of World War II. And it kind of had to, because if Britain didn't control the Mediterranean to some degree and the Suez Canal, Britain as an imperial power would have been broken. But it did mean that the Far East, for example, was completely starved of modern aircraft, most warships, well-trained troops, etc. It was just completely starved of them.
Yeah, even to the degree of the deployment of anti-aircraft assets and heavy artillery. Like for instance,
that was all in the Middle East. Yeah. It was all in the Middle East, and the Germans, the Russians used to take the piss, because at the Battle of Alamein, I think Britain used 6 divisions, I think maybe 7, and the Russians used to say, "Oh, that was a skirmish, mate."
Yeah. That was like the opening phase of Stalingrad, for instance,
Yeah.
Well, what I was gonna say was that the scale of fighting was like so much different, and you look at somewhere like Russia, even though Russia had poor roads and scant railways and whatever, and obviously with Russia you got the Raputista and the Thor and the spring rains and whatever. Like the desert is just such an unusual place to fight. It's hot, it's barren, there's not much water, there's very little in the way of cover. It's just such an inhospitable place, Yeah,
no, I totally agree.
Right. Well, I think the next main part of Churchill's wartime career would be the Atlantic Charter with Roosevelt. Yeah, I mean, pretty much writing it off.
We got Mr. Iron Dukin's teachers now.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, like again with this ultra nationalist, imperialist, king of the right wing, and he just writes off the entire empire in one document.
Yeah, the Atlantic Charter. So let's sign something that is totally against the British Empire.
Yeah.
Because that's what the Atlantic Charter was and was meant to be. And instead of Churchill turning around and saying to Roosevelt, "No, I'm not signing this," he did.
Absolutely. And Churchill is, by the way, he mentioned to Stalin one time that India should be run on a Soviet-style system. I don't know if that was in Yalta or Tehran, but he said that to Stalin one of the conferences. And this is the thing of the US really was the main geopolitical enemy of Britain in the 20th century, and it's kind of
for some of the 19th century too, to be honest.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like I do have some sympathy for the idea of balance of power and preventing a hegemon, but any single argument you can make for Germany saying, like, if we'd left them alone or left them to grow and dominate Danzig and all this stuff, they would have been so powerful. Even if it does make sense, you can apply that twofold, fivefold, tenfold to the United States.
Well, yeah, there's that. But I mean, also, look, if Germany spent, let's say, up to 1942 conquering the East, let's say they're successful, but there's no war in the West, so France is still there and building up its forces. So's Belgium, so's Holland, so's Britain. How are we worse off?
Precisely.
I just don't get it. I don't understand what we gained by going to war in September 1939.
I mean, we didn't have anything to gain. And on top of that, afterwards, Finland gets invaded by the Soviets. Churchill does nothing.
Absolutely.
In fact, on top of that, he ignored the Japanese intervention in China in 1930s.
Well, I kind of think he should have, but, why did Britain care who was invading China? I'm a real politic guy, all right? If it's not directly affecting Britain, why do we care? I regard Britain in the 1930s as a great nation with a world empire, not a school prefect.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Why do I care who runs Manchuria?
Mm-hmm. That's fair enough.
As a British guy,
That's fair enough. But the thing is with Churchill, it's just like any dictator can do whatever they want in the 1930s, with one exception. And the one exception is, we've got to have absolutely everything for war, no matter what. And if that means signing away the empire, it's worth it. If that means giving away all our resources to America, that's worth it. If it means doing a deal with your supposed ultra enemy, the communists, then it's worth it. And it's just not a strategy, frankly. It's an emotional decision.
It's just craziness. It's like I watched the new Culture Forum video on Churchill with that Manchu guy, and it was just bullshit. It was just typical boomer bullshit about Churchill. And I'm not quite a boomer, but I almost am. But
an honorary boomer.
But it was just bullshit. Oh, Britain had to go to war because otherwise, morally, this, that, or the other. When the hell did morals ever have anything to do with a country? Mm-hmm. When were there morals when America firebombed every Japanese city with its paper and wood houses? When they dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and the other place? Was there morals in that? Was there morals when Britain bombed Dresden or when Germany bombed Coventry? Morals don't come into nations.
Or when the Americans dispatched the Lusitania across the Atlantic and then lied about its manifest for 90 years.
Yeah, morals do not come into nations. They just don't. I'm sorry. Or how many Iraqis and Afghans did we kill over 20 years for no purpose whatsoever, given we lost both wars? Morals? We're now supporting jihadis who are basically ISIS, really, Al Qaeda, the same guys who supposedly did 9/11 in America, we're now supporting those guys in Syria. Morals in nations. Give me a break.
Interesting. It kind of reminds me of Syria. The Anschluss. Basically, we were talking about how Italy could have been the linchpin of all of this stuff. And basically, there's this time when Schuschnigg stops receiving calls from Mussolini. And Italy basically says, look, we're not helping you anymore. And literally days later, the Germans are in and the Anschluss happens, which is really remarkably similar to what happened with Assad and Putin.
Yep. I mean, and Putin, of course, is Putla somehow or another. I don't really know why, but apparently.
Yeah, that's fair
and
enough.
Britain should be desperately keen to support the most corrupt nation in Europe, which is Ukraine.
Of course. Yeah,
it's the idea that nations have morals is insane to me, because they just don't. Sometimes, like I'd say, for example, in the 1982 Falklands War, right was on Britain's side because we were invaded and we needed to chuck the bastards out. But that's a rare thing, really. That's a rare thing.
So what would you say is the max? Oh, sorry, please go on.
No, so sorry, Street. Just the commenter here, Sijul, says that Churchill used the Soviet invasion of Finland as justification to invade neutral Norway and potentially to intervene in Sweden for the latter's iron. And of course, for those who don't know, Germany did. Although there are iron reserves in continental Europe, or at least there were at the time, Germany did like high tensile, high quality steel, and the best steel in Europe actually came from northern Lapland, like the northern Scandinavia, of which the Swedes had a great deal of iron mines, and Sweden did profit heavily off selling their iron ore to the Germans in World War II, and it's actually as much as Churchill can be rightly judged for its Western British hypocrisy about intervention, yada yada yada, and violating neutrality. It was protecting Swedish iron was also one of the sort of thoughts behind German strategy in terms of their operation to capture both Denmark and Norway, to control the straits into the Baltic, the Kattegat, where Denmark is, and as well they figured the British would go for it, and by all means, once the Germans started dropping paratroopers in Norway, well, the British Marines were on their amphibious ships, so it was a case the Germans beat them to the punch. But there you go.
That's totally true. I mean, look, we can talk briefly about Churchill's invasion of Italy, which he described as a soft underbelly of Europe. Well, it didn't really turn out to be that way.
Famous last words, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways, Churchill, and it was Churchill who pushed for the Italian campaign. The Americans were not at all keen on it. In some ways, it's quite reminiscent of what he did at Gallipoli in World War I. He was always looking for a way round when, if you don't defeat the main body of the enemy, messing around on the side ain't going to do it. It wasn't helped, to be fair, that one of the worst American generals of World War II, Mark Clark, was in charge of the main American army. And rather than trapping the German army, which is what he should have been interested in, what Mark Clark wanted to do was have the glory of capturing the Eternal City. He was much more interested in capturing Rome than he was in cutting off the German army. And as a result, most of the German army just withdrew north of Rome and formed a new line. And of course, the Germans, when the Italians basically changed side, but not all of them. There was the...
It's true to say that Italy broke out into civil war, really, if you think about it.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
kind
fair.
of did. Communists and everybody, yeah.
Fair. And on top of that, it's like you think about our naval supremacy. Italy has such an enormous coastline. Having that constant threat of a naval invasion would have probably committed more troops than an actual full-on invasion. For example, like Napoleon, he never knew when an invasion could occur on the coast of France. So he had 300,000 troops at all times because he was terrified of a British invasion of Belgium or Normandy or all that sort of stuff. And all those troops were tied up.
The original Atlantic Wall, you might say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And one of the things with Hitler in D-Day was all the German generals and leadership had an incredible anxiety about where it was going to be. And when they finally did land, Hitler's reaction was like, "Oh, well, at least we know where they are now."
Yeah, because the great difficulty obviously was that a great deal of them, particularly von Rundstedt and I believe von Kluge was of the same mind that the Calais was the obvious place, whereas Rommel was fairly convinced it would be Normandy because of Cherbourg and deep water ports and the and being able to split the river that runs via Caen. And that's, of course, where they ended up landing.
Absolutely. So after the taking of Sicily, if you continue to hit and run tactics on the Italian coast, and that would have taken a lot more German manpower while not risking too much of our own. But of course, Churchill has to go through these incredibly mountainous regions right in the center of Italy with Monte Cassino, and it was just foolish. What do you guys think about some of the other invasion plans he has? So specifically during D-Day, he wants to do Marseille, which was successful, but he also wanted to basically do a naval invasion of, I guess you could call it Slovenia or Venice, in order to go further east and cut off the Soviets as the Germans were retreating.
With what ships and landing craft?
Well, exactly.
And also it would have been impossible to have supported troops at the top of the Adriatic. Like, even though by 1944 the Axis don't have much in the way of naval assets, the problem is you're so far even behind like their aircraft umbrella, and the Adriatic Sea. Most people know what it looks like, but basically it's what separates Italy from the Balkans, and this basically it's not a wide strait. It is a sea. That's why we call it the Adriatic. But it's a relatively narrow sea that sort of splits the Balkans from Italy, and it's just like the ships would be sitting ducks in there, and then trying to get supplies. If you ferry them to say Istria, to Trieste or to Pola or to one of these, Venice, even one of these cities or a couple of these cities, but then they would be fighting essentially like in a 200-degree axis around wherever they would land, and it's just like really it makes no military sense. And not even take for example, I love that scene from Longest Day where von Rundstedt, he laments that he says that, oh, Normandy, it makes no military logic, and then he concludes that, and that's the genius of it because it's not predictable. But there's a difference between contravening military logic to be unpredictable and brilliant, and then there's just doing something extremely stupid like landing at the Dardanelles. Landing in the Istria or in the Adriatic like Slovenia would have just been an impossible operation to have supported, even in 1944, to be frank.
Last British defeat of World War II was I think it was the Dodecanese Islands in very late 1943 and early 1944. The British forces in the Middle East, which were responsible for doing this, told Churchill, we do not have enough ships, we don't have enough men, and it's too far away for the Air Force to support it. And there are no aircraft carriers. And so Churchill still insisted, as he always did, and they landed in the Dodecanese Islands, and the Germans counterattacked, The British lose a whole brigade at a time when Germany's losing the war everywhere.
Well, any industrial warfare, you need to go for the industrial heartland, and then the stranded little troops around it just don't matter. The Americans got it eventually with island. After island hopping, they realized if you just conquer the fleet and ignore the islands.
Well, you have to conquer some of the islands, but you can go around a lot of them. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, yeah, they should have just focused on sorting out the Rhineland.
I think some of the Dodecanese islands was that Churchill wanted a purely British victory, and the British military and naval guys told him you can't get one here, and he didn't listen because he never listened. Sir Alan Brooke, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, and you can go and read Sir Alan Brooke's diaries, and they're very telling. He spends most of World War II up until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning arguing with a more or less drunk Churchill about what he the British should or should not do. And Alan Brooke's his great gift to Britain in World War II was that he managed eventually to persuade Churchill out of most of his more crazy plans, which, had they gone ahead, would have all been disasters.
Right.
Without a single exception. Churchill never had a good strategic idea in his head in his entire life. As we said in the last stream, he never commanded more than about 40 cavalry troopers ever in the field. And he thought he was a naval expert as well as an army expert, and he was neither.
He, funnily enough, was responsible for less men under his command than the mustache man, ironically, who rose to corporal, just for context sake.
He was responsible for less men under his command than I've had, because I've commanded a company of just over 100, but there we go.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. You're more qualified than Churchill, Iron Duke. There you go.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I honestly have commanded more men, more than double as many men. But yeah, Churchill was a strange, romantic, overly emotional, not totally pro-British character, and that's my real summing up of him, to be honest. He never had a cold, hard, pro-British view in his head. Never. Which is what you needed. And of course, in 1945, we had a general election, and the overwhelmingly socialist education officers that had been around and were put there by the Labour Party, or by the national government, which was basically the Labour Party, during the war, overwhelmingly they were socialists, and they were teaching British Army soldiers, and to a slightly lesser extent, Royal Navy sailors and RAF guys, what to do, and they were all overwhelmingly socialist. And so when the 1945 election came around, Churchill was kicked out on his ass by an enormous majority for Labour.
Well, on top of that, I mean, not only did they suspend elections from 1935 until 45, but the by-elections, the ones that were allowed, had a remarkable number of independents win. For example, in Grantham, and totally against the Uniparty. Not necessarily anti-war people got elected, but the fact that independents are elected, some of the only chances that the people get, shows you something, and that's mid-war.
Well, I mean, we also need to mention the Far East, and as we said earlier, When he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, Churchill was very much against completing the defences of the Royal Navy base in Singapore. And yet he claims in his books, written, post-World War II, I was amazed that Singapore was not the Gibraltar of the Far East. He damn well knew it wasn't, because he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer who refused to spend money to complete the defences. And he was also the Prime Minister who repeatedly would not send British forces to the Far East, would not send modern British tanks to the Far East, would not send modern British fighter aircraft to the Far East.
And
Instead,
what few went were very, very small in number.
And what he did send, he sent them to Stalin and the Soviet Union, not the Far East.
Just on that topic, because it is hard to, in this day and age, of course, there's a lot of embellishment in media, but there's a very, very good documentary. Oh, it's like a documentary / like miniseries, right? It's called Menzies at War, and it's a very modest Australian production. You'd know Iron Duke, because you live down here where I am as well, and you'd be familiar with the actor Bud Tingwell from The Castle. He plays Churchill, and funnily enough, I think he's, for all the big blockbuster productions about Churchill last like 10 years or so, like the two movies that they did, Darkest Hour, and the other one that they did like in the last sort of 5 or so years.
I hated it.
Bud Tingwell, I think, actually played the best Churchill, funnily enough. And it's like I said, it's a very modest miniseries, but it very, very, very keenly delves into the strained relationship between Australia's Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, and Sir Winston Churchill, obviously the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the United Kingdom. And it very much touches on the strained relationship between the two and the completely sort of dimorphic thinking between them. And Menzies, you got to think, being a Commonwealth Prime Minister, was absolutely attuned to the risk that Japan posed to Australia geostrategically and operationally. And he absolutely understood the importance of Singapore as like a fortress town, and also the how vital it was to keep a hold of Malay, and the Straits of Malacca.
Singapore was kind of the outer bastion of Australia.
Yeah, it was absolutely. Yeah, and I recommend, if anyone can get a hold of that series, it's worth looking at. It's called I'm pretty sure it's called Menzies at War, and it's like I said, it's not showy, it's not it's not high budget or anything. It's actually quite modest. I don't know if it was done by our ABC here. If it is, it's the last decent thing they've made, but it is actually quite a good insight. And also too, I believe the Menzies family gave them access, because Robert Menzies actually had his own personal video camera, and he actually took a lot of footage himself, and a lot of those clips are actually in the documentary. So I do highly recommend, if anyone's interested, that is well worth a watch.
Menzies was also like a big supporter of the White Australia policy, by the way. But,
correct.
Yeah, and when Britain
and actually tried to ban the Communist Party in Australia just after World War II. Actually, funnily enough.
Yep. And when Britain went to war in 1939, Australia sent 2 divisions to the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
But when Australia was threatened, Churchill was extremely reluctant to send British divisions to help Australia. Extremely reluctant, because it wasn't Germany, you see. They weren't fighting Germany, they were fighting Japan.
Exactly. And also too, I think Churchill had an obsession with Gibraltar, with the Suez, with the the Near East, the oil from Iraq. Because let's not forget as well that British interests in the Near East did coincide with proven and known oil reserves, which at the time were sort of Iraq, Iran, Baku, some parts of Syria. The Italians did lead expeditions to Libya, and they did extract some oil from Libya, but it was in relatively modest amounts, like compared to the reserves that were discovered, in the post World War II era, and particularly in the Gaddafi era. And it's actually kind of funny that like my granddad and his war buddies just like lament the fact that they would run out of gasoline and diesel and oil and whatever, and they were like literally marching on top of it, But the Near East was so important for the Royal Navy and for the Royal Air Force and for the motorization of the British Army, which was like a process that all these armies undertook throughout the 20s and 30s and into the 40s. And so Churchill was very, very fixated on that. And like you say, Iron Duke was fixated on defeating and combating Germany to the point where he was actually completely negligent about the risk that Imperial Japan posed to Australia and the Commonwealth and Oceania.
As I said, instead of sending modern British tanks and modern British fighter aircraft to the Far East, maybe even to Australia, he was sending them to Stalin in Russia. And remember when we said a couple of hours ago, when we started this stream, he was supposedly an extreme anti-Bolshevik. Supposedly.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, of the two, at the very least, Menzies was in fact anti-Bolshevik. Like he actually tried to ban the Communist Party in Australia, whereas
Totally
Churchill just spoke a big game and did sweet FA about it. Frankly speaking,
Churchill even tried to, like, obviously when the Japanese invaded New Guinea, which in those days was an Australian colony. In fact, years ago, I used to go out with a girl who was born in New Guinea, an Australian girl, because her dad was one of the administrators there, colonial guys, instead of letting these Australian troops go back from the Middle East to Australia in order to defend Australia, because New Guinea was an Australian colony, Churchill tried to send them to Burma, which the Australian government turned around and said, no, we're not doing that, boys. And I don't damn well blame them either. Although I also think it's worth mentioning that the first Allied soldiers to defeat the Germans on land were probably the Australians in Tobruk, who defeated...
the desert rights,
Yeah, they defeated Rommel's attack. And the same blokes, when they arrived in New Guinea, managed to be the first Allied soldiers to defeat the Japanese on land as well. So
exactly, on the outskirts of Port Moresby,
Yeah, Australians can be pretty proud of that. They did pretty well for a country which in those days, I think, only had about 8 million people.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing too. I mean, whether it's World War I or World War II, I mean, both Australians and New Zealanders were famed for, maybe they didn't quite have the the military finesse of, say, like the Germans, or they didn't maybe have the the recklessness of the Americans.
Very courageous soldiers,
but very courageous, very tough, very adaptable, very resilient, and whoever they came across, whether it was Germans or Turks in World War I, or indeed the Japanese in World War II, and I mean, Rommel talks about it himself. Other generals have said much the same, that the Australians were a very much respected force from a relatively modest country. The Australian men who fought in World War I and World War II, and you could fairly confidently say the same for Vietnam, is that they were universally respected by friend and foe alike, and that's one of the unique distinctions that Australia has in that regard. Very much pushed above the state.
Anglo-Boer War, also Australian troops had a good reputation in the Anglo-Boer War.
Absolutely.
Not always the how shall I put this? The Australians were inclined to bend the rules sometimes. In World War I, for example, the Germans knew them as not always inclined to take prisoners, but it's a war.
That's right, exactly.
It's a war. Surrender, or if you can't fire your machine gun at me until I'm 100 yards away and kill all my mates, and then I'm going to say, all right, mate, I'll just take you prisoner. Nah, I'm going to bayonet you in the guts. That's what's going to happen, you know. Surrender at the right time, which needs to be a distance if you're going to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, I'm sure many a time the Australians would have heard the cries of Nick Schiessen, you know, in the trenches of the Hindenburg Line. Yeah.
No, for sure, and that, you know, that's true of a lot of soldiers. You're not going to see loads of your mates shot, and then you get 50 meters away from the enemy, and they suddenly fling their hands up, and you're just going to say, "Oh, all right, chum, I'll just take you prisoner. You just killed my best mate, but never mind."
Yeah.
I mean, you know, but
Exactly.
fair enough. All right, guys, we've been going on a long time. Mr. Streets, any final thoughts?
Maybe a quick comment on the final deals that Churchill made with Stalin, the naughty document, division of Balkans and
Greece
Eastern
was
Europe.
going to be Western, although he actually had to use the British Army to fight there for a year at least to defeat the Greek communists. But yeah.
Do you think it was the best he could do in a difficult situation, or could he have taken more from Stalin?
I don't think he could have, to be honest, with the number of British troops he had available. If there had been no British troops in Greece, I can guarantee you that Greece would have gone communist for sure.
Yeah. In the case of these agreements, I think by 1945, and you look at the location of sort of where the lines more or less settled, you know, between Eastern Front forces and Western Front forces, and by Western Front I include the Mediterranean, obviously, as well, is that really Stalin more or less imposed upon Churchill, and by that point Truman, a fait accompli. The Red Army was in most of these locations. The Red Army had, you know, taken Romania, had taken Bulgaria. I mean, Tito was in charge of Yugoslavia. Tito's kind of his own partial example. He's his own little entity there. You know, the Germans and the Soviets had more or less linked arms at the Elbe River. They were more or less fighting for the scraps at that point. You know, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, you know, was all like that, where the lines of contact all met. And really, in many ways, probably the Allies, without the use of nuclear weapons, they probably got about as good as they could have hoped for. And the British, at least to their credit, were smart enough, and I believe Monty led that, or was it Horrocks? Or maybe it was Horrocks under Monty's direction. I think 30 Corps.
Yeah, they
cut off.
They
cut off Denmark. Yeah, they cut across the what do you call it, the Jutland Peninsula, and secured Denmark, which is probably one of the more intelligent things that they did. And in doing so too, you might be aware of this, but they managed to nab, or rather, you know, I know Himmler committed suicide, but they managed to sort of nab that nascent Flensburg government under Dönitz.
I think Himmler
Flensburg's
was
on the border of
killed,
Denmark.
Actually,
So.
I think Himmler was killed, but I don't really care.
No, I get it. But what I'm saying is Flensburg, the reason I call it the Flensburg government is that Flensburg was a German city/town on the close to the Danish border. And so the British kind of secured Denmark geostrategically and managed to secure Dönitz and that sort of nascent rump government at the same time. But regarding Churchill as well, I think it is kind of frustrating, sort of, I suppose, in summary, where you sort of see him, you know, as a younger man and between the wars, you know, or he touches on, you know, like, you know, international finance and these people, the meddlers, whatever, you know, and then throughout World War II, he defaults back to his craze, sort of almost sort of seething, you know, spittle-inducing Germanophobia, like his absolute, you know, his single-minded hatred of the German people and the German nation, only to then at the end of World War II realizing he's empowered the Soviets to the degree that they have and has just opened the door to the Red Army, and, you know, half of Europe is lost to them, including some of the, you know, the Britain's, you know, erstwhile allies in the form of, say, Poland and the Czechs and whatever, these people whom ostensibly the Western allies went to war for, and you know, and then immediately he gets voted out of power in 45 when, you know, Churchill's usefulness is done with.
obviously he has a resuscitation in political fortunes when he wins a 55 election and he prevails in the Malay crisis. But I think Churchill is rightly a polarizing figure, and I think it's only right for British patriots of the modern day and for people who, you might say, can see between the lines of modern history to rightly judge Churchill for his foibles and his errors, and to not, sort of blindly lionize him, as I'm sure most of us did. I mean, I did growing up as a teenager. I thought Churchill was, the man of the hour in many respects, and was the man that England needed. And then you sort of look back in retrospect and you sort of think to yourself, well, actually, he's the man who sort of almost single-handedly threw Europe into the maelstrom of war.
I have been told within the last week that criticizing Churchill by someone I like, by the way, I've been told that criticizing Churchill is basically having a go at Britain and British history. I'm sorry, I don't think it is.
It's just a manipulation tactic.
I believe in Jonathan Bowden's statement. We have to, as British guys, as Anglo guys, we have to step over World War II.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And the other thing is too is actually in understanding it in its context and understanding it with open eyes. That is the most important thing. And that doesn't actually mean flipping, like, shall I say, 180 degrees to the other side, where, and I'm not saying this with any particular person in mind, or like I'm not trying to like broad brush people with a broad stroke, for instance, right? It's like, it's not to say that you should also say that the other side is faultless or that no one else made mistakes. Like, there's war is a complicated undertaking, and in geopolitics and world affairs and ideology, there are almost an infinite number of moving parts and factors at play and personalities and people and whatever. Like it's complicated, right? We have to judge it accordingly.
I'm extremely proud of the British sailors, soldiers, and airmen of World War II. Many of them were very, very, very brave men. Extremely
courageous,
proud.
resilient.
I'll never slag them off. Never ever. But that Winston Churchill was a politician. He wasn't a fighting man.
No. And this is the thing too. Like I really don't like one of the things, and you got to say, like, I'm saying this as someone who's, as I've alluded to on this stream, like my grandfather did, fight on the other opposite side here. And one of the great things, because, a lot of British men did settle in Australia after the war, and many Brits call themselves Aussies, that sort of stuff. And I will always treasure that any RSL that, my grandfather interacted with.
I bet he could go there.
Every Remembrance Day and every Anzac Day, he was always telephoned and invited. And I had the pleasure of going with him when I was a boy, and I'll treasure that for the rest of my life, because I think a great deal of particularly Commonwealth soldiers, Americans too to their credit, but Commonwealth soldiers always sort of after the war, were quite gentlemanly about the whole affair and saw their fellow fighting men as, for what they were and for who they were, rather than trying to make some like Marvel hero bullshit out of world history. And the qualities that those men displayed under duress as a matter of duty should never be forgotten. And I really think it's gratuitous when people in our sphere slag off the fighting men as being drones and minions and whatever.
Yeah, it's not fair,
because they displayed character and courage that people like us, well, maybe not you, Andrew, because I know you were formerly a fighting man, but that most of us cannot fathom.
The Furius, most of the British, Australian, Italian, German, even Russian fighting men in World War II were nationalists.
Yeah, they were.
Most of
and heroes for their country. And heroes for their country.
Yeah. No, I'm not talking about the fucking politicians at all.
Yeah, exactly.
But the actual guys who risk their lives, whether they be officers or men, those guys, they were right wing in modern terms, nationalists, who were just fighting for the country.
Or at the very least, patriotic. Exactly.
Yeah, 100%, mate. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. I just don't like to see the slagging off of fighting men. I think people like
They
us
were
should rise
just
above
doing
that.
what they were ordered for the most part.
Well, their duty,
Yeah, they were doing their duty. Exactly right. Any final thoughts, Mr. Streets?
Well, I think Churchill represents, I was going to say maybe 2 or 3 generations of the cream of Britain, basically. And you're right, so brave, and as a people and as a generation, but just gambled, really, all for one man's ambition. Really, it has to be said.
Well, several men's ambitions, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's fair enough. And so much more productive things we could have put our youth into in both the First World War and
destroying
the Second World
Europe
War.
was not a good plan. I've got to say that.
Mhm.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's my view entirely. I'm never going to slag off the fighting men who did their best. They did their best. They risked their lives. I've met so many brave British and Australian guys who fought in World War II. I've also met some from Germany and Italy who fought in World War II, who were just doing their best, and had very little choice about where they were going to go and fight. They were just sitting there, But Winston Churchill, he did more than any other single man, in my humble opinion, to destroy British power and the British Empire at any stage between 1900 and 1945. And it wouldn't have been that difficult not to have done that.
Absolutely.
I agree. I mean, we had the capital, not just financial capital, but the social capital, technological capital, the philosophical capital. Over 500 years of building us up to where we were in the early part of the 20th century. It didn't need to be floundered, and
all
it just
chucked
didn't have
away
to
in 50 years, mate. All chucked away in 50 years. 100%.
And Churchill has to have a lot of the blame for that.
All right, guys, we've been going almost 3 hours. So, Mr. Streets, is there anything you would like to plug before we finish?
Genuinely not. And I said the same thing last time, I think. I really should think of something by now, but I just love history. And especially our
Welcome
history,
to the party,
of course.
pal.
Exactly, right. And I just can't help myself,
Well, I'm going to say what I always say when I'm on with Furius. Please, can we at some stage do this Caesar stream we've been talking about for ages?
Yes, we have. We have to.
Furious! Hang on, I meant to tell you.
Yes.
Mr. Streets is mates with the guy who does the Cost of Glory.
Oh, well,
yeah, he's great.
Yeah, and he tells me he might be able to get him to join us doing a stream like that. And I'm an enormous Cost of Glory channel fan.
Very enticing.
Yeah, I'd love to do a stream on like ancient Roman history with that guy for sure.
And I was going to say, pity he couldn't join us today. But I mean, I'm sure you guys are aware that Bo's working through a massive compilation of Caesar's life as well. And I think if there's someone in our circles who knows about as much as Caesar as I do, it's definitely Bo. So
Bo is excellent on that stuff. Absolutely. I'm so sorry he didn't join us this evening.
I did shoot him a message, but on a couple of I think Discord and whatever. But yeah, no, he just didn't reply. So maybe maybe he turned in early for the night. Who knows?
He maybe Maybe he had emergency. I hope
I,
he's
I,
nothing
I
bad.
yeah, absolutely. I hope I was able to stand nobly in his stead anyway. Because I mean, he did a superb job from what I could tell from what I watched last week. So
Yeah, no, but Bo's excellent. Like I did a stream with Bo on the Battle of Trafalgar, which was very good. Anyway, Furious. Anything you would like to plug?
Not a whole lot. I have done a couple streams. Myself and Apostolic Majesty have put out a little bit of stuff in the tail end of this year, and we do have some things potentially in the works for the new year. We're still to sort of finalize those things. And I think myself and Mr. Bo himself, History Bro, have something cooking. Actually, on that note too, I last time I travelled overseas, I did a I was in person. We did a discussion about early Rome, the rise of the Republic, the Roman Kingdom, the glossing over the Aeneid, and the basically the work of Virgil and Polybius, and discussing the rise of Rome. We had meant to try and get to the Punic Wars, but as often happens with Bo and I, we fit a lot in, and in 2 hours we only got to the end of the Samnite Wars. So hopefully we can follow
Classic, yeah.
typical Furious, I know, like loquacious and complicated, but anyway, I do my best to service
Furious.
our dear friends.
Have you seen the video, The Myth of the Battle of Cannae?
Is that the one that just recently dropped with Invictus and Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy?
Yeah, well, no, he
I
did
watched it
one
last night.
first. Yeah, he
Yeah,
did one first, but then he just did one with Adrian Goldsworthy. And
Yeah.
as you probably know, Adrian Goldsworthy is one of the best
Yes.
military historians on ancient Rome. He's written some great books about the
He's excellent.
Roman army.
Fair enough.
He cut his mustard under Peter Connolly, who was a very, very famed Roman military historian who sadly is long deceased now. But yes, because he actually talks about Peter Connolly in that stream actually.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I thought it
But
was.
Adrian Goldsworthy is magnificent. Yes, I'm a very big fan of
he's got
his.
a very good YouTube channel, by the way.
Yes.
Where
He drops content regularly, actually. Like he probably drops like 4 videos a week. Like he's very prolific, actually, for like a normie historian.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Adrian Goldsworthy, and of course he also writes historical novels about the Napoleonic Wars, and I think he's just written one about the British Army in Normandy in 1944. But yeah, he's a very good historian.
Yes.
He's another one of my favorite ancient channels, shall we say? But yeah, I love Costa Glory, and I also like Told in Stone. He's pretty good, but he's not really a military historian. He's more of a general ancient historian.
Just for the record too, two things I can recommend, because never mind him being a prolific content creator, in terms of his streams and discussions, he's obviously a prolific writer. He's written some very good books. He basically has a 2-part series talking about the sort of Roman-Persian wars. One from strictly military, or not strictly, but from a largely military standpoint, and the great Roman-Persian wars, and then another one basically talking about the sort of like the clash of civilizations, the sort of Greco-Roman civilization and the sort of Persian, Parthian, Zoroastrian sort of civilization. One's called the Eagle and the oh god, I've forgotten now. And then there's a sort of a second book that is basically like the Roman-Persian wars specifically. I actually haven't read them. I've read excerpts of them because I've had to like investigate bits and pieces for various streams and whatever. But I when I do my next book order, I actually intend to get both, because he's probably alongside sort of Victor Davis Hansen and Eric Klein and Andrew Wallace Hadrill are sort of one of the few historians I still take seriously. His stuff is excellent. I'm a big fan of Adrian Goldsworthy.
Yeah, he's not been completely overtaken by lefty liberalism.
Well, he still uses BC80, doesn't he? You know, that's always a tell.
Yeah, exactly, which is always quite telling, if you ask me. It's like, oh God, what's that British woman's name?
Mary Beard.
Yeah.
God. Like her history is basically, if you were a feminist in ancient Rome, which never existed, you'd probably agree with Mary.
Yes.
But
Yes, if you're a Parthian transvestite in Alexandria, you know.
yeah,
Anyway.
which probably didn't exist very much. But anyway, yeah, absolutely.
We
If
digress.
you were Elagabalus, but yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
On the road to Babylon, you know.
Yeah.
A good point. A good point. Yeah, a good point. But yeah, okay. So yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen, Mr. Streets and Furious Pertinax, for coming on. I am so sorry. I am so sorry that History Bro didn't come on. I will change the title later on. And if History Bro has anything to say about this subject, I will be more than happy to just do an hour or so stream with him if he wants to do that. And I hope nothing unpleasant has happened to him. But anyway, thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks.
Cheers, dude. Subscribe to the channel and all that stuff that we always tell people. And I'll be back tomorrow for a regular splendid isolation stream, which will be 201. Going a long time now.
Wow.
Bye, all.
So anyway, go all, guys.
Great. Bye-bye.